The gentle rustle of bamboo leaves in the evening breeze carries whispers of a time when honor meant more than life itself, where the flash of polished steel decided the fate of empires, where warriors lived by codes so rigid that death became preferable to shame. Tonight, we journey through 8 centuries of blood, steel, and unwavering devotion to explore the complete history of Japan's legendary samurai. From humble provincial guards to the ultimate rulers of an island nation, this is their story. Picture, if you will, the year 792. The imperial court in Kyoto glitters with silk and gold. Aristocrats compose poetry while gazing at cherry blossoms, and the emperor's word shapes the destiny of millions. Yet something fundamental is about to change, something that will transform Japan from a peaceful, court-centered society into a warrior nation that would endure for 700 years. The seeds of that transformation are already being planted in the distant provinces, where younger sons of noble families grow restless with ceremonial life and hunger for something more substantial than courtly intrigue. The government's decision to end conscription in 792 seems at first glance like a minor administrative adjustment. But like a single stone that triggers an avalanche, this seemingly small change will reshape the entire structure of Japanese society. Without a central army to maintain order across the vast archipelago, local strongmen begin filling the vacuum. They recruit their own warriors, establish their own territories, and slowly but surely begin challenging the supremacy of the imperial court that had ruled unchallenged for centuries. In the provinces, far from the perfumed halls of the capital, a different kind of nobility is emerging. These are men who measure their worth not in classical Chinese poetry or court appointments, but in the weight of their swords and the loyalty of their followers. They call themselves samurai, meaning simply those who serve, but their service will eventually encompass far more than their humble name suggests. They will become the backbone of a military aristocracy that will dominate Japan until the 19th century. The Heian period stretches before us like a vast canvas painted in contrasts. In Kyoto, the Fujiwara clan perfects the art of political manipulation, controlling emperors through marriage alliances and bureaucratic expertise. Their world revolves around aesthetic refinement, where the ability to select the perfect shade of silk for a kimono matters more than military prowess. Court ladies like Murasaki Shikibu pen literary masterpieces, while their male counterparts engage in elaborate games of precedence and protocol. This is a civilization at its cultural peak, producing art and literature that will endure for millennia. Yet even as the court reaches new heights of sophistication, the foundations of its power are crumbling. The Shun system service with tax-exempt estates creates a network designed to reward loyal of private holdings that gradually slip beyond imperial control. Powerful families establish their own domains, complete with private armies to protect their interests. The court, focused on ceremony and culture, barely notices as real authority begins shifting from the capital to the countryside. It is in this environment that two names begin to echo through the corridors of power: Minamoto and Taira. Both clans trace their origins to the imperial family itself. Founded when Emperor Saga's expanding household threatened to bankrupt the imperial treasury, dozens of princes and their descendants found themselves stripped of their royal status and granted new clan names instead. Some might have seen this as disgrace, but the founders of these new houses recognized opportunity where others saw setback. The Minamoto, established in 814, and the Taira, founded 11 years later, represent a new breed of aristocrat. Unlike the court nobles who derive their authority from proximity to the emperor, these clans build their power on military prowess and territorial control. They marry into wealthy provincial families, absorbing their resources and expanding their influence across multiple provinces. Within generations, they command networks of warrior retainers that rival the imperial army itself. The early samurai who served these great clans are a far cry from the sword-wielding warriors of popular imagination. They are mounted archers first and foremost, masters of the composite bow, who can loose arrows with deadly accuracy while controlling their horses with their knees. Their primary weapon is not the katana, which exists only in primitive form, but the powerful asymmetrical longbow that can pierce armor at 200 paces. The curved swords they carry serve mainly for close combat when their arrows are exhausted, and more importantly, for the ritual collection of enemy heads that serves as proof of their achievements in battle. These warriors begin their training as children, learning to ride almost before they can walk. By age 10, they can hit targets while galloping at full speed. They have, by 15, mastered the 18 martial arts that define samurai education: archery, horsemanship, swordsmanship, spearfighting, swimming, and a dozen other skills that combine practical utility with spiritual discipline. But beyond mere physical training, they absorb something more profound, a code of conduct that will eventually crystallize into the philosophy known as Bushido. The way of the warrior emerges gradually from the practical necessities of military life. When death lurks behind every battle and honor determines one's place in the social hierarchy, certain principles become matters of survival. Loyalty to one's lord transcends personal interest. Courage in the face of overwhelming odds becomes a virtue more valuable than life itself. The willingness to die rather than accept dishonor transforms into a religious obligation. These are not abstract philosophical concepts, but practical guidelines for warriors who must function effectively in a world where failure often means death. The influence of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto weaves through this emerging warrior ethic like threads in a tapestry. Buddhist acceptance of suffering and impermanence helps warriors face death without fear. Confucian emphasis on hierarchy and duty provides a framework for organizing military society. Shinto concepts of purity and spiritual power imbue martial activities with sacred significance. The result is a unique synthesis that elevates warfare from mere violence to a spiritual discipline comparable to religious practice. As the 11th century progresses, the balance of power in Japan begins shifting decisively. The Fujiwara clan's mastery of court politics serves them well in times of peace, but their influence depends entirely on their ability to manipulate emperors and control bureaucratic appointments. They possess no military forces of their own, no territorial base, independent of imperial favor, no means of projecting power beyond the capital's walls. When challenged by forces that operate according to different rules, their sophisticated political machinery proves inadequate to the task. The Minamoto and Taira, by contrast, build their authority on foundations that cannot be swept away by changes in imperial favor. They control vast territories across multiple provinces, command the loyalty of thousands of warriors, and possess the military capability to enforce their will through force of arms. Their power grows not from court appointments, but from their ability to protect their followers and expand their territories through conquest. They represent a fundamentally different model of authority, one based on military strength rather than bureaucratic skill. The competition between these great military clans intensifies throughout the late Heian period, as they vie for influence over the imperial succession and control of key government positions. Each side recruits allies among the provincial warrior families, promising rewards and advancement in exchange for military service. The court, caught between these competing forces, attempts to play them against each other while maintaining the fiction of imperial supremacy. But the growing militarization of politics makes such manipulation increasingly dangerous, as disputes that once would have been resolved through negotiation now threaten to explode into open warfare. The stage is set for a confrontation that will determine not just which clan will dominate the others, but whether Japan will continue under the refined rule of court aristocrats or transition to the harsh governance of military strongmen. The warriors who will fight this decisive conflict have spent generations honing their skills, perfecting their equipment, and developing the institutional structures necessary for large-scale warfare. Their composite bows can penetrate the finest armor. Their horses have been bred for speed and endurance. Their tactical knowledge has been tested in countless smaller conflicts across the provinces. Most importantly, they have developed the psychological framework necessary for the type of total warfare that will soon engulf Japan. The code of honor that governs their conduct makes retreat from battle virtually impossible. Their commitment to personal loyalty ensures that they will fight to the death for their chosen lords. Their acceptance of death as preferable to dishonor means that they will show no mercy to enemies and expect none in return. When these warriors finally clash in decisive battle, the conflict will be resolved not through compromise or negotiation, but through the complete destruction of one side or the other. The gentle court culture of the Heian period is about to give way to an age of iron and blood, where survival depends not on the ability to compose elegant poetry or navigate complex social protocols, but on the speed of one's sword and the strength of one's arm. The transformation will be swift, violent, and irreversible, marking the end of one chapter in Japanese history and the beginning of another that will endure for centuries. The gathering storm reaches its breaking point in the year 1156, when what should have been a routine imperial succession dispute explodes into the first great military confrontation between the rising warrior clans. The Hogan Rebellion, named for the era in which it occurs, seems almost anticlimactic in its brevity. 3 years later, the Meiji Rebellion follows, lasting mere hours before decisive victory is achieved. Yet these brief conflicts accomplish what centuries of gradual change could not. They demonstrate conclusively that military force has replaced court intrigue as the ultimate arbiter of political power in Japan. Emperor Sutoku's attempt to reclaim the throne he had been forced to abdicate provides the spark. But the real combustion comes from the military alliances that form around the imperial claimants. The Minamoto and Taira find themselves on opposite sides of the conflict, their long-simmering rivalry finally given legitimate expression through competing loyalties to different branches of the imperial family. When the fighting begins, it becomes immediately clear that this is no mere palace coup, but a fundamental test of strength between Japan's two greatest military powers. The speed with which these conflicts resolve reveals the decisive nature of samurai warfare when fully committed. Unlike the prolonged sieges and strategic maneuvering that characterize military campaigns in other parts of the world, Japanese warriors prefer swift, decisive engagements where individual prowess and unit cohesion can determine outcomes within hours rather than months. The composite bow, so central to samurai military identity, proves devastatingly effective in these close-range urban battles, while the psychological impact of witnessing enemy commanders fall in single combat often determines the battle's outcome before numerical superiority can assert itself. Taira no Kiyomori emerges from these conflicts as the clear victor, his forces having demonstrated superior organization and tactical flexibility. But victory brings responsibilities that prove as challenging as the battles themselves. The Taira must now govern a nation that has never been ruled by military men, adapting warrior values to the complex demands of imperial administration. Kiyomori's solution reveals both his political acumen and the limitations of his background. He attempts to rule through existing court structures while gradually replacing key personnel with his own supporters. The transformation proves more difficult than anticipated. Court nobles who have spent generations perfecting the subtle arts of bureaucratic administration watch with barely concealed disdain as warriors attempt to master protocols they consider impossibly crude. The Taira, accustomed to direct command relationships and immediate obedience, struggle with the indirect methods that make court politics function. Cultural conflicts emerge daily as military efficiency clashes with ceremonial tradition. creating friction that undermines the very stability Kiyomori's victory was meant to establish. Meanwhile, surviving Minamoto leaders retreat to their traditional strongholds in the eastern provinces, where they begin the patient work of rebuilding their military capabilities. The defeats of 1156 and 1159 have taught them valuable lessons about the importance of preparation and the dangers of premature commitment. In the mountainous regions around what will later become Kamakura, they establish training camps where young warriors perfect their skills, while older veterans develop new tactical approaches designed to counter Taira advantages. The eastern provinces provide an ideal environment for military reconstruction. Far from the court's scrutiny, Minamoto leaders can recruit freely among the provincial warrior families, who have grown increasingly restive under Taira dominance. The harsh landscape breeds hardy fighters accustomed to privation and sacrifice, while the region's history of frontier warfare has produced military traditions that emphasize practical effectiveness over ceremonial display. These warriors care little for court rank or bureaucratic appointment. They measure a leader's worth by his ability to provide opportunities for advancement and his willingness to share the risks of battle. Minamoto no Yoritomo, despite his youth, demonstrates remarkable skill at building the coalition that will eventually challenge Taira supremacy. His approach differs fundamentally from traditional Japanese political methods, relying less on family connections and court influence than on direct military relationships with provincial strongmen. He offers concrete rewards for loyalty, expanded territories for successful commanders, administrative positions for capable subordinates, and the promise of rich plunder for common warriors. Most importantly, he provides something the court-centered Taira cannot: a vision of governance that places military virtues at its center rather than treating them as unfortunate necessities. The code of conduct that emerges within Yoritomo's forces reflects this fundamental reorientation of political values. Where court culture emphasizes aesthetic refinement and social harmony, warrior culture celebrates martial prowess and personal honor. Where aristocratic tradition values subtlety and indirection, military necessity demands clarity and decisive action. The synthesis that emerges from this philosophical transformation will eventually become the foundation for an entirely new form of government, one that places the warrior class at the apex of social hierarchy rather than serving as instruments of aristocratic power. Religious elements weave throughout this military transformation, providing spiritual justification for what might otherwise appear as mere rebellion against legitimate authority. Buddhist temples, particularly those associated with warrior families, begin developing theological frameworks that present military service as a form of spiritual discipline comparable to monastic practice. The taking of life in battle, traditionally considered a violation of Buddhist principles, becomes reinterpreted as a necessary sacrifice for the protection of the Dharma and the maintenance of cosmic order. Shinto concepts prove even more adaptable to warrior needs, with their emphasis on spiritual purification through ritual action and their celebration of martial virtues as expressions of divine power. The kami, or divine spirits, associated with warfare and protection, receive increased veneration, while new rituals develop to consecrate weapons and invoke divine assistance in battle. The famous practice of inscribing prayers on arrow shafts transforms each shot into a form of religious offering, while the collection of enemy heads becomes not merely proof of victory, but a ritual presentation to the spirits who have granted success. As the 1170s progress, signs of impending conflict multiply like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. Taira control of the imperial court becomes increasingly heavy-handed as Kiyomori attempts to secure his family's position through marriages with the imperial family and the elimination of potential rivals. His daughter's marriage to Emperor Takakura and the subsequent birth of Prince Antoku provide the Taira with unprecedented influence over the imperial succession, but also create new vulnerabilities as competing claimants emerge with their own networks of support. The economic foundations of Taira power begin showing strain as the costs of maintaining control over both court and provinces exceed the resources available through traditional taxation methods. Trade with Song China provides substantial revenues, but these commercial relationships depend on maintaining stability across the sea routes that connect Japan to the continent. The increasing militarization of Japanese politics threatens these delicate arrangements, as foreign merchants become reluctant to risk their investments in a country that appears to be sliding towards civil war. Provincial unrest spreads as local warrior families chafe under Taira administration that combines military occupation with bureaucratic inefficiency. The traditional reciprocal relationships that bind lord and vassal together depend on mutual benefit and shared risk. But Taira governors often lack the local knowledge necessary for effective administration, while their distance from actual fighting reduces their credibility as military leaders. Complaints reach Yoritomo's headquarters with increasing frequency, each one representing a potential ally in the coming struggle. The breaking point arrives in 1180, when Prince Mochihito, Emperor Go Shirakawa's son, issues a call for the overthrow of Taira dominance and the restoration of legitimate imperial rule. The prince's rebellion provides the legal justification that Yoritomo has been seeking, transforming what might otherwise appear as clan warfare into a struggle for imperial legitimacy. The response across the eastern provinces is immediate and overwhelming, as warrior families who have spent decades preparing for this moment finally receive permission to act on their accumulated grievances. The Genpei War that erupts from this royal proclamation will consume Japan for the next 5 years, involving every major warrior family and transforming the political landscape in ways that will endure for centuries. Unlike the brief conflicts of the 1150s, this struggle will be fought across multiple provinces, with armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Naval battles will complement land campaigns as both sides attempt to control the sea routes that connect Japan's scattered islands. Most significantly, this war will establish new principles of military organization and political legitimacy that will form the foundation for Japan's transformation into a warrior state. The stage is set for a conflict that will determine not merely which family will dominate Japanese politics, but what form that domination will take and how it will be justified to a population that has known only imperial rule for more than 4 centuries. The gentle court culture of the Heian period is about to be swept away by forces that it helped create, but can no longer control. The drums of war echo across the mountains of central Japan as 1180 dawns with unprecedented violence. Prince Mochihito's call to arms has transformed years of simmering resentment into open rebellion, and the eastern provinces explode into coordinated uprising against Taira authority. Yet the initial engagements reveal how unprepared both sides remain for the scale of conflict they have unleashed. The Battle of Ishibashiyama in August demonstrates this brutal reality as Yoritomo's hastily assembled forces suffer devastating defeat against a smaller but more experienced Taira army. The young Minamoto leader barely escapes with his life, fleeing through mountain paths while his scattered followers regroup in hidden valleys. This early disaster teaches crucial lessons about the difference between local skirmishing and coordinated military campaigns. Individual valor and clan loyalty, while essential, prove insufficient against disciplined formations commanded by veterans of previous conflicts. The romantic ideals of single combat that dominate warrior literature clash harshly with the practical necessities of large-scale warfare. But defeat often provides more valuable education than victory, and Yoritomo demonstrates remarkable capacity for learning from failure. Rather than attempting immediate revenge, he devotes months to careful preparation, building supply networks, establishing communication systems, and most importantly, creating institutional structures that can coordinate the activities of dozens of independent warrior bands. His headquarters at Kamakura becomes more than a military camp. It evolves into the nucleus of an alternative government designed specifically to serve warrior interests. The administrative innovations that emerge from this period reflect fundamental differences in how military leaders approach governance compared to court aristocrats. Where the imperial bureaucracy operates through layers of protocol and precedent, warrior administration emphasizes direct relationships and immediate accountability. Commands flow down clear chains of authority, while information travels upward through established channels that bypass the ceremonial filters that characterize court communication. The result is a system capable of rapid decision-making and efficient resource allocation, qualities that prove essential as the conflict expands across multiple fronts. Religious legitimacy becomes increasingly important as both sides seek to justify their actions to populations that have been taught to revere imperial authority as divinely ordained. The Taira's control of the capital provides them with access to the emperor and the formal mechanisms of government, enabling them to present their opponents as mere rebels against legitimate rule. Yoritomo counters this advantage by cultivating relationships with powerful Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, particularly those associated with Hachiman, the deity of war and divine protector of the Minamoto clan. The spiritual dimensions of the conflict extend far beyond simple propaganda, touching the deepest beliefs about the relationship between earthly authority and cosmic order. Warrior culture has always emphasized the importance of spiritual purification before battle, but the scale of the Genpei War requires new forms of religious observance adequate to its unprecedented destructiveness. Temples throughout eastern Japan develop elaborate rituals for blessing weapons, consecrating battle standards, and ensuring divine protection for armies that may campaign for months far from their home provinces. The economic foundations of warfare undergo similar transformation as both sides discover that traditional methods of military financing prove inadequate for sustained campaigns. Local lords can support small bands of retainers through agricultural surplus and craft production, but armies of thousands require systematic resource mobilization that strains existing economic structures. The Minamoto's eastern strongholds provide access to horse-breeding regions essential for cavalry warfare, while their control of mountain passes enables them to tax trade routes that connect interior provinces with coastal ports. Maritime warfare assumes unprecedented importance as both sides recognize that control of sea routes determines the movement of troops and supplies between Japan's scattered islands. The Taira's traditional naval superiority, built on their dominance of trade with China and their alliances with coastal communities, initially provides decisive advantages. Their ships can transport forces rapidly between threatened positions while denying similar mobility to their opponents. However, the Minamoto's recruitment of experienced sailors from fishing communities gradually narrows this gap, leading to increasingly sophisticated naval engagements. The Battle of Fujigawa in 1180 demonstrates how psychological factors can determine military outcomes, regardless of numerical superiority or tactical advantage. Taira forces advancing toward Minamoto positions panic when waterfowl, startled by their approach, create sounds that nervous sentries interpret as enemy cavalry charges. The resulting retreat occurs without actual combat, yet it devastates Taira morale while providing Minamoto forces with valuable equipment and supplies abandoned by their fleeing enemies. Word of this bloodless victory spreads rapidly through the provinces, encouraging further defections from the Taira cause. Siege warfare develops new levels of sophistication as both sides fortify strategic positions designed to control key transportation routes and communication networks. The mountainous terrain that dominates central Japan provides numerous natural strongholds, but these require extensive modification to withstand prolonged assault by forces equipped with the latest military technology. Engineering expertise becomes as valuable as individual fighting skill, with specialists in fortification design commanding respect and resources comparable to renowned warriors. The social implications of extended warfare begin transforming relationships within the warrior class itself. Traditional bonds between lord and retainer based on personal loyalty and shared risk, evolve into more complex arrangements that accommodate the administrative requirements of large-scale military organization. Written agreements supplement oral oaths as campaigns extend beyond the personal relationships that govern small warrior bands. Merit-based promotion begins supplementing hereditary status, as commanders discover that effective leadership requires skills that transcend noble birth. Women's roles within warrior society undergo significant modification as the demands of extended campaigns separate fighting men from their families for unprecedented periods. The wives and mothers of absent warriors assume increased responsibility for managing agricultural estates, maintaining political alliances, and even organizing local defense against enemy raids. Some, like the legendary Tomoe Gozen, participate directly in military campaigns, demonstrating fighting skills that rival those of their male counterparts, and earning recognition as full members of the warrior community. The cultural production of wartime society reflects these changing social dynamics through the emergence of new literary forms designed to commemorate military achievements and preserve tactical knowledge for future generations. War tales begin supplementing court literature as the dominant form of narrative entertainment, with stories of individual heroism and strategic brilliance replacing accounts of romantic intrigue and aesthetic contemplation. These martial narratives serve practical purposes beyond mere entertainment, preserving information about successful tactics and inspiring young warriors to emulate the achievements of celebrated heroes. As 1183 approaches, the strategic balance begins shifting decisively in favor of the Minamoto coalition. Yoritomo's patient construction of institutional frameworks starts producing advantages that individual courage and tactical skill cannot overcome. His ability to coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple provinces, maintain supply lines over vast distances, and integrate the efforts of dozens of independent commanders creates military capabilities that exceed anything previously seen in Japanese warfare. The eastern provinces have become a unified military state capable of projecting power across the entire archipelago. So, the Taira's initial advantages in court legitimacy and naval superiority prove insufficient to counter this systematic military organization. Their forces, while individually capable and well-equipped, lack the institutional coherence necessary for sustained resistance against coordinated assault. Command disputes between family members undermine strategic planning, while their dependence on court-based resources limits their ability to adapt to changing military circumstances. Most critically, their identification with imperial authority becomes a liability, as that authority loses credibility through association with military failure. The psychological momentum of the conflict reaches a tipping point as provincial strongmen throughout Japan begin calculating the probable outcomes of continued resistance versus accommodation with the rising Minamoto power. Each defection weakens Taira military capabilities while strengthening their opponents, creating a cascade effect that accelerates the collapse of resistance. The careful political work that Yoritomo has invested in building relationships with potential allies finally bears fruit as former enemies recognize the futility of opposing forces that can offer both immediate protection and long-term opportunities for advancement. The stage is set for the decisive phase of the conflict, where individual battles will determine not merely military supremacy, but the fundamental character of Japanese government for centuries to come. The gentle court culture that has dominated Japan for 400 years stands on the brink of replacement by a military system that will reshape every aspect of social organization, from the imperial palace to the humblest farming village. The final act of this great drama unfolds across the scattered islands of the inland sea, where the remnants of Taira power make their last desperate stand against the rising tide of Minamoto dominance. The year 1184 witnesses a series of engagements that demonstrate how completely the nature of Japanese warfare has evolved from the ceremonial conflicts of earlier eras. At Ichi no Tani, Minamoto forces under the command of Yoritomo's brilliant younger brother, Yoshitsune, execute a dawn assault that combines tactical innovation with psychological warfare in ways that will be studied by military strategists for generations. The cliff-top fortress of Ichi no Tani appears impregnable from the sea, its defenders confident that the steep terrain protecting their rear makes surprise attack impossible. Yet Yoshitsune's reconnaissance reveals narrow deer paths that wind through the mountains behind the fortress, routes so treacherous that no reasonable commander would consider them viable for military movement. This assessment proves fatally incorrect, as Yoshitsune leads a hand-picked force of mounted archers down slopes so steep that horses must be lowered by rope in some sections. The psychological impact of warriors appearing where none should exist transforms tactical surprise into complete demoralization. Taira defenders, awakened by war cries echoing from the cliffs above their supposedly secure positions, abandon carefully prepared defenses in panic-stricken flight toward their ships. The resulting slaughter demonstrates how traditional samurai emphasis on individual combat becomes meaningless when coordinated assault eliminates the possibility of honorable single combat. Victory belongs not to the bravest warrior, but to the most innovative commander. Yoshitsune emerges from this triumph as a military genius whose tactical creativity complements his brother's political acumen in ways that make Minamoto victory appear inevitable. His ability to identify unconventional approaches to seemingly impossible problems reflects the new military thinking that characterizes successful warrior leadership. Unlike court generals, who rely on precedent and established protocol, these Eastern commanders adapt their methods to specific circumstances, treating each engagement as a unique puzzle requiring creative solution rather than ritualized performance. The naval dimension of the conflict assumes unprecedented importance as the retreating Taira concentrate their remaining forces on ships that provide both transportation and mobile fortresses. Their mastery of seamanship, accumulated through generations of trade with China and coastal warfare, initially provides decisive advantages in engagements where Minamoto forces must fight in an unfamiliar environment. The complex tides and currents of the inland sea create tactical opportunities that experienced sailors can exploit against land-based opponents unfamiliar with maritime warfare. Yet even these advantages prove temporary, as Minamoto recruitment of fishing communities and coastal strongmen gradually creates naval capabilities adequate to challenge Taira's supremacy at sea. The conversion of merchant vessels into warships demonstrates the improvised character of a much medieval naval warfare, where victory depends more on boarding actions and individual combat than on specialized naval tactics. Archers positioned on elevated platforms attempt to clear enemy decks before grappling hooks draw vessels close enough for sword work that determines the final outcome. The psychological dimensions of this maritime campaign extend far beyond simple military considerations, touching fundamental questions about the relationship between land-based warrior culture and the alien environment of the sea. Samurai training emphasizes horsemanship and archery skills developed for terrestrial combat, while naval warfare requires different capabilities that challenge traditional measures of martial excellence. The adaptation process proves traumatic for warriors whose identity depends on mastery of specific skills that become irrelevant in maritime engagements. Religious observances during this period reflect the desperate character of the struggle, as both sides invoke divine assistance through increasingly elaborate rituals designed to ensure supernatural support. The Taira's possession of the imperial regalia, including the sacred mirror, sword and jewel that symbolize legitimate imperial authority, provides them with powerful spiritual weapons that complement their military capabilities. These sacred objects, traditionally housed in the imperial palace, travel with Taira forces as tangible proof of their divine mandate to rule Japan. The Minamoto counter this spiritual advantage through intensive cultivation of relationships with Hachiman shrines throughout eastern Japan, presenting their cause as a holy war to restore legitimate imperial rule corrupted by Taira usurpation. The warrior deity's association with archery and mounted combat resonates powerfully with samurai religious sensibilities, while the god's role as protector of the imperial throne provides theological justification for rebellion against those who claim to serve imperial interests. Economic warfare becomes increasingly important as both sides recognize that military victory depends on the ability to sustain extended campaigns across multiple theaters of operation. The Taira's control of trade routes connecting Japan to China provides access to luxury goods and manufactured items that can be exchanged for military supplies. But this commercial network proves vulnerable to disruption by hostile forces. Minamoto raids against Taira-controlled ports demonstrate how economic targets can provide strategic advantages comparable to military victories. The social transformation accompanying this extended conflict accelerates as traditional class boundaries blur under the pressure of military necessity. Farmers and artisans find themselves pressed into military service as both sides expand their recruitment beyond the traditional warrior class. The resulting armies include significant numbers of combatants whose primary loyalties lie with local communities rather than aristocratic patrons, creating command challenges that require new approaches to military organization and motivation. Marriage alliances assume unprecedented political importance as both sides attempt to secure the loyalty of wavering provincial strongmen through family connections that transcend immediate military considerations. These arrangements, traditionally based on considerations of social status and economic advantage, become instruments of strategic policy designed to create lasting political obligations. The children of such unions represent investments in future stability, rather than mere expressions of contemporary alliance. The role of Buddhist monasteries in this conflict reflects their evolution from purely religious institutions into significant political and military actors. Major temples possess extensive landholdings that require military protection, while their educated monks provide administrative capabilities that prove valuable for record-keeping and communication. Some monasteries maintain their own armed forces, creating a third factor in the struggle that both sides must court or neutralize depending on local circumstances. Intelligence gathering develops new levels of sophistication as commanders recognize that information about enemy movements and intentions often proves more valuable than additional troops or superior equipment. Networks of spies and informants extend throughout the combat zone, with merchants, traveling monks, and displaced refugees serving as unwitting or deliberate sources of military intelligence. The ability to intercept and interpret enemy communications becomes a specialized skill that influences strategic planning and tactical execution. The technological aspects of warfare undergo significant innovation as craftsmen adapt existing tools and techniques to meet the demands of large-scale combat. Improvements in armor design balance protection against mobility, while advances in metallurgy produce weapons capable of penetrating the most sophisticated defensive equipment. The famous curved swords that will become synonymous with samurai identity reach new levels of perfection during this period, as swordsmiths experiment with folding techniques that create blades of unprecedented sharpness and durability. Siege equipment borrowed from Chinese military manuals appears for the first time in Japanese warfare, with catapults and other mechanical devices supplementing traditional assault methods. However, the mountainous terrain that dominates much of Japan limits the effectiveness of such equipment, while the preference for rapid movement over extended siege operations reflects cultural values that emphasize individual prowess over engineering capabilities. Medical knowledge advances rapidly as battlefield experience provides unprecedented opportunities for treating wounds and managing the health problems that accompany extended military campaigns. Warrior families develop specialized expertise in treating arrow wounds and sword cuts, while the movement of large armies creates new challenges related to sanitation and disease prevention. The survival rates of wounded warriors improve significantly during this period, contributing to the overall effectiveness of military forces. The final phase of the Genpei War approaches as 1185 dawns, with both sides recognizing that decisive resolution cannot be postponed indefinitely. The economic costs of sustained warfare strain the resources of even the wealthiest families, while the social disruption caused by years of conflict threatens the agricultural foundation upon which all political power ultimately depends. Public opinion, traditionally irrelevant to aristocratic conflicts, becomes increasingly important as war-weary populations begin questioning the wisdom of continued fighting. The stage is set for a confrontation that will determine not merely which clan will dominate Japanese politics, but whether the emerging warrior state will prove capable of creating stable institutions adequate to govern a society transformed by years of unprecedented violence. The gentle court culture that once seemed eternal lies in ruins, replaced by military values that celebrate death before dishonor and loyalty above life itself. The samurai have become the undisputed masters of Japan, but their ultimate test lies ahead: the challenge of transforming military conquest into lasting political authority. The No-Ura Shim narrow straits of Danma under the spring sun of 1185. Their deceptively calm waters about to witness the most decisive naval battle in Japanese history. Here, where the currents of the inland sea meet the open waters of the Pacific, the fate of two great clans and the future direction of Japanese civilization will be determined in a few hours of desperate combat. The Taira fleet, carrying the remnants of their military power, along with the child emperor Antoku and the sacred imperial regalia, represents the last hope of a dying political order. Opposing them across these treacherous waters lies the Minamoto Navy, a hastily assembled collection of converted merchant vessels and fishing boats manned by warriors whose experience lies primarily on horseback, rather than ship-de. The tactical situation reveals the fundamental transformation that 7 years of warfare have wrought in Japanese military thinking. Traditional samurai combat, with its emphasis on individual prowess and honorable single combat, proves almost meaningless in the confined spaces of ship decks, where victory depends on coordinated group action and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The curved longbows that have served as the primary samurai weapon must compete with the specialized requirements of naval archery, where wind, wave motion, and the rolling deck of one's own vessel combine to make accurate shooting exponentially more difficult. Minamoto commanders face the additional challenge of motivating warriors whose cultural identity revolves around mounted combat to fight effectively in an alien maritime environment. The psychological adaptation proves as difficult as the tactical one, as men who have spent their lives measuring courage by their willingness to charge enemy positions on horseback must now demonstrate their valor while struggling to maintain footing on rolling ship decks. The transformation reveals how completely the demands of total warfare have superseded traditional concepts of appropriate military behavior. The Taira advantage in naval experience becomes apparent as the engagement begins, with their more maneuverable vessels using superior seamanship to gain favorable positions for archery exchanges. Their knowledge of local tide patterns provides crucial tactical intelligence, as the complex currents around Dan no Ura can either assist or hinder ship movement, depending on timing and position. The morning tide favors the Taira, whose experienced captains exploit these conditions to achieve temporary superiority that seems to promise victory for the imperial cause. Yet the tide that provides early advantage also establishes the temporal framework within which the battle must be resolved, as changing currents will inevitably shift tactical opportunities from one side to the other. This natural rhythm imposes constraints on both fleets that supersede individual tactical preferences, creating a race against time that adds psychological pressure to the already intense physical demands of combat. Warriors accustomed to battles that end with the death or flight of enemy commanders must adapt to engagements where natural forces determine the duration and character of combat. The defection of Taguchi forces in the midst of battle demonstrates how political loyalty remains fluid even at the moment of decisive engagement. The Sakoku warriors' decision to switch sides reflects calculations about probable outcomes that transcend immediate tactical considerations. revealing how military effectiveness depends ultimately on the ability to maintain coalition unity under extreme pressure. The psychological impact of witnessing allies change sides during combat proves as devastating to morale as actual casualties, creating panic among Taira forces who suddenly find themselves outnumbered and surrounded. Individual acts of heroism and desperation punctuate the broader tactical movements as warriors from both sides attempt to influence the battle's outcome through personal valor. The famous encounter between Nasu no Yoichi and the Taira fan provides a moment of traditional single combat that contrasts sharply with the chaotic group fighting occurring elsewhere in the battle. The Minamoto archer's successful shot at a fan target mounted on a Taira vessel demonstrates the continuing relevance of individual skill, even within the context of mass warfare, while also serving as a powerful symbol of Minamoto superiority. The presence of the child Emperor Antoku aboard the Taira flagship transforms the battle from a simple military engagement into a struggle for the very symbols of imperial legitimacy. The sacred regalia carried with the imperial court represent more than mere ceremonial objects. They embody the divine authority that has legitimized Japanese government for centuries. Their potential capture or loss threatens to undermine the theological foundations of imperial rule itself, making the battle's outcome significant far beyond its immediate military consequences. As the tide begins to turn both literally and metaphorically, Taira resistance collapses with shocking suddenness. The realization that defeat has become inevitable triggers a wave of ritual suicides among the Taira leadership, as warriors choose death before dishonor, in accordance with the emerging samurai code. The drowning of Emperor Antoku, carried beneath the waves by his grandmother Nai no Ama, symbolizes the complete destruction of the old political order and the triumph of military values over court traditions. The recovery of 2 of the 3 imperial regalia from the battlefield provides the Minamoto with crucial symbols of legitimacy, while the loss of the sacred sword to the depths of the inland sea creates a theological crisis that will perplex imperial scholars for generations. The incomplete recovery of the regalia suggests that divine favor itself remains divided, creating interpretive challenges for the victorious Minamoto as they attempt to establish religious justification for their political dominance. The aftermath of Dan no Ura reveals the thoroughness of Minamoto victory and the completeness of Taira destruction. Surviving members of the defeated clan face execution, exile, or forced monasticism, while their extensive landholdings undergo redistribution among Minamoto supporters. The systematic elimination of potential rivals demonstrates the harsh realities of medieval politics, where defeat in decisive battle typically means the complete destruction of one's political existence rather than mere temporary setback. Yoritomo's reaction to news of the victory reveals the complex psychology of successful military leadership, as triumph brings not celebration, but immediate concern about the challenges of governing a nation transformed by years of warfare. The destruction of the Taira removes the last significant obstacle to Minamoto dominance, but it also eliminates the external threat that has unified the Eastern Warrior Coalition. The political skills required for maintaining unity among allies during peacetime differ fundamentally from those needed for wartime leadership, creating new challenges that will test Yoritomo's capabilities as thoroughly as any military campaign. The establishment of a new political order begins immediately as Minamoto administrators arrive in former Taira territories to assume control of local government and assess the resources available for supporting the emerging warrior state. These early occupation policies reveal the systematic planning that has characterized Minamoto's strategy throughout the conflict, with detailed procedures for integrating defeated populations and redistributing confiscated property according to principles that reward loyalty while encouraging continued military service. The religious implications of victory require careful management, as Buddhist and Shinto institutions struggle to interpret the defeat of forces that had claimed divine sanction for their cause. The Minamoto victory suggests that the gods favor military virtues over court refinement, but this interpretation challenges traditional concepts of imperial divinity. that have provided stability for centuries. New theological frameworks must be developed that accommodate warrior dominance while preserving the essential religious foundations of Japanese civilization. The cultural transformation accompanying political change becomes apparent as warrior values begin displacing court aesthetics throughout Japanese society. Literature, art, and music all reflect the new emphasis on martial themes, while educational practices shift toward preparing young men for military service rather than bureaucratic careers. The refined sensibilities that characterized Heian court culture survive primarily in religious contexts, where Buddhist and Shinto traditions preserve elements of the old aesthetic while adapting to serve new political masters. Economic reorganization proceeds systematically as Minamoto administrators implement policies designed to extract maximum resources for military purposes while maintaining agricultural productivity. The complex Shun system that had evolved during the Heian period undergoes significant modification to serve warrior rather than aristocratic interests, with new forms of land tenure that emphasize military service obligations over traditional court relationships. These changes create opportunities for advancement based on military merit, while establishing the economic foundations necessary for maintaining large standing armies. The international implications of the Genpei War's outcome extend beyond Japan's borders, as news of the conflict reaches China and Korea, where observers attempt to assess the significance of Japan's transformation from court-centered to military-dominated society. The interruption of trade relationships during the war years has created economic disruption that affects commercial networks throughout East Asia, while the emergence of a unified military state in Japan alters the regional balance of power in ways that neighboring countries must take into account. The stage is set for the most ambitious political experiment in Japanese history, the creation of a government designed specifically to serve warrior interests while maintaining the complex administrative structures necessary for governing a sophisticated agricultural society. The success or failure of this experiment will determine whether military conquest can be transformed into stable political authority, and whether the samurai who have proven so effective at destroying the old order possess the skills necessary for creating a new one. The victory at Dan-no Ura reverberates across Japan like thunder rolling through mountain valleys. But for Minamoto, no Yoritomo, triumph brings burdens as weighty as the sword he carries. The complete destruction of Taira power leaves him master of an archipelago transformed by warfare, yet the very thoroughness of his victory creates new challenges that no amount of military prowess can solve through force alone. The eastern provinces that served as his base of operations must now become the foundation for governing territories stretching from the northern wilderness of Mutsu to the southern islands of Kyushu, each region possessing its own customs, dialects, and local power structures that have evolved over centuries of relative independence. The warriors who followed Yoritomo to victory expect rewards commensurate with their sacrifices, yet the redistribution of Taira lands, however extensive, cannot satisfy every claim or fulfill every promise made during the desperate years of civil war. The mathematics of patronage prove unforgiving. Thousands of supporters must be accommodated with resources confiscated from hundreds of enemies, creating a fundamental imbalance that threatens to transform yesterday's allies into tomorrow's rebels. The solution requires political innovation as radical as the military tactics that won the war, demanding institutional structures capable of channeling warrior ambitions into productive service rather than destructive competition. Yoritomo's decision to establish his capital at Kamakura rather than moving to Kyoto reveals his understanding that effective governance requires physical separation from the court traditions that had proven inadequate to the challenges of military rule. The choice of location demonstrates strategic thinking that extends far beyond immediate convenience, as Kamakura's position in the Kanto Plain provides access to the horse-breeding regions essential for cavalry warfare while maintaining defensive advantages that protect against potential threats from Western rivals. The site's sacred associations with Hachiman, the warrior deity who has blessed Minamoto victories, provide religious legitimacy for this unprecedented departure from established governmental practice. The architectural program that transforms Kamakura from a modest provincial town into the seat of military government reflects the new political values that will define samurai rule. Unlike the sprawling palace complexes of Kyoto, designed for ceremonial display and aesthetic contemplation, Kamakura's governmental buildings emphasize functional efficiency and defensive capability. Administrative offices cluster around training grounds where mounted archers perfect their skills, while residential quarters house the families of warrior administrators whose duties combine bureaucratic responsibilities with military obligations. The integration of civilian and military functions within a single architectural framework symbolizes the fundamental unity of authority that distinguishes warrior government from court rule. The legal innovations that emerge from Yoritomo's administrative experimentation establish precedents that will influence Japanese governance for centuries. The appointment of shugo, or military governors, to oversee provincial administration creates a new category of official whose authority derives from military appointment rather than court rank or hereditary privilege. These governors possess both civil and military responsibilities, serving simultaneously as tax collectors, judges, and military commanders within their assigned territories. Their dual role reflects the militarization of all governmental functions that characterizes the emerging samurai state. The Jito system represents an even more radical departure from traditional administrative practice, creating a new class of land stewards whose authority stems directly from military service rather than aristocratic birth or court favor. These officials receive rights to collect taxes and administer justice on specific estates in exchange for military service obligations that can be activated during times of crisis. The arrangement provides local administration while maintaining the military readiness essential for defending against potential threats, creating a synthesis of civilian and military authority that proves remarkably effective. Religious policy during this formative period reveals Yoritomo's sophisticated understanding of the role that spiritual authority plays in legitimizing political power. Rather than challenging existing Buddhist and Shinto institutions directly, he cultivates relationships with influential temples and shrines while gradually redirecting their activities to serve military rather than court interests. The patronage of Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on mental discipline and acceptance of hardship, provides spiritual frameworks that complement warrior values while offering alternatives to the more elaborate ceremonial traditions associated with court Buddhism. The development of legal codes specifically designed for warrior society represents one of Yoritomo's most significant innovations, as these documents establish systematic procedures for resolving disputes that arise within military hierarchies while maintaining the flexibility necessary for adapting to changing circumstances. The Goseibai Shikimoku, though formally promulgated decades later, reflects legal thinking that begins during Yoritomo's reign, as administrators attempt to codify the customary practices that govern relationships between lords and retainers. These early efforts at systematic jurisprudence demonstrate the intellectual sophistication that accompanies military conquest, revealing how warrior culture adapts scholarly methods to serve practical governmental needs. The economic foundations of the new political order require careful construction as Yoritomo attempts to balance the resource extraction necessary for maintaining military forces with the agricultural productivity that sustains the entire system. Traditional court taxation methods, designed for a stable hierarchical society, prove inadequate for supporting the mobile military forces that patrol extensive territories while remaining ready for immediate deployment against external threats. New approaches to resource mobilization must accommodate the irregular demands of military campaigns, while ensuring that agricultural production continues at levels sufficient to support both civilian populations and warrior establishments. Trade policy assumes unprecedented importance as the disruption caused by years of warfare threatens commercial relationships that connect Japan to continental markets. The reconstruction of trading networks requires diplomatic as well as economic initiatives, as foreign merchants must be convinced that the new military government can provide the stability necessary for profitable long-term investments. Yoritomo's administrators develop innovative approaches to commercial regulation that balance the need for tax revenue with the importance of maintaining competitive conditions that encourage continued trade expansion. The integration of defeated Taira territories into the Minamoto governmental system presents challenges that test every aspect of the emerging administrative structure. Local populations that have lived under Taira rule for generations must be convinced to accept new authorities whose legitimacy rests on military conquest rather than traditional political relationships. The process requires delicate balancing between demonstrating the consequences of continued resistance and offering incentives for cooperation that make accommodation more attractive than rebellion. Cultural policy during this period reflects the tension between preserving valuable elements of court civilization and establishing new traditions that celebrate warrior achievements and values. The patronage of literature and art continues, but with emphasis on themes that glorify military virtues and commemorate the struggles that established samurai dominance. The war tales that emerge during this period serve both entertainment and educational functions, preserving tactical knowledge while inspiring young warriors to emulate the heroic examples of their predecessors. Marriage politics become increasingly complex as Yoritomo attempts to bind potential rivals to his cause through family relationships that create lasting obligations transcending immediate political calculations. The arrangement of unions between Minamoto supporters and daughters of defeated Taira families serves multiple purposes, providing mechanisms for integrating former enemies while creating hostages that ensure continued loyalty. These marriages also preserve valuable bloodlines that might otherwise be lost through the systematic elimination of defeated rivals. The challenge of succession planning emerges as a crucial concern despite Yoritomo's relatively young age, as the stability of the entire governmental system depends on ensuring smooth transitions that prevent the kind of civil conflict that might invite intervention by ambitious rivals. The development of institutional structures capable of functioning effectively, regardless of individual leadership, becomes a priority that influences every aspect of administrative organization. The creation of advisory councils, bureaucratic procedures, and legal frameworks that can operate independently of personal charisma represents one of Yoritomo's most important long-term contributions to Japanese governmental development. International relations require careful attention as news of Japan's political transformation reaches neighboring countries that must reassess their diplomatic and commercial relationships with the archipelago. The emergence of a unified military state alters regional power balances in ways that affect trade routes, military alliances, and cultural exchanges throughout East Asia. Yoritomo's administrators must develop foreign policy approaches that maintain beneficial international relationships while asserting Japan's independence and protecting its interests against potential external threats. The psychological transformation that accompanies political change becomes apparent as warrior values gradually displace court aesthetics throughout Japanese society. The emphasis shifts from aesthetic refinement and literary accomplishment toward martial prowess and practical standards for measuring effectiveness, creating new individual worth and social status. This cultural revolution proves as significant as the political changes that accompany it, fundamentally altering Japanese identity in ways that will influence the nation's development for centuries. The establishment of educational institutions designed specifically for training warrior administrators represents another crucial innovation, as the new governmental system requires officials who combine military skills with bureaucratic competence. These schools develop curricula that balance martial arts training with instruction in law, administration, and classical learning, producing a new class of warrior scholars whose capabilities exceed those of either traditional court bureaucrats or simple military leaders. The military reforms implemented during this period establish organizational structures that will define samurai warfare for generations. The development of standardized training procedures, equipment specifications, and tactical doctrines creates professional military forces whose effectiveness transcends the personal relationships that had previously determined warrior loyalty and capability. These innovations transform the samurai from a loose confederation of clan-based warriors into a disciplined military class capable of coordinated action across vast territories. The construction of communication networks that can rapidly transmit information and commands across the archipelago becomes essential for maintaining effective control over dispersed territories. The establishment of relay stations, message routes, and signal systems enables Kamakura administrators to coordinate activities throughout Japan while maintaining awareness of potential threats that might develop in distant provinces. These infrastructure investments demonstrate the systematic planning that characterizes successful governmental innovation. As the 12th century draws to a close, Yoritomo's political experiment appears to have succeeded beyond even his most optimistic expectations. The institutional structures he has created provide stable governance while maintaining the military readiness essential for defending against potential challenges to samurai authority. Yet the very success of these innovations creates new problems that will test the durability of warrior rule, as the initial generation of Kamakura administrators gives way to successors who inherit power rather than earning it through military achievement. The stage is set for the next phase of samurai political development, where the challenge shifts from establishing authority through conquest to maintaining power through effective administration. The warrior class that has proven so effective at destroying the old order must now demonstrate its capacity for creating lasting institutions that can survive the inevitable succession crises and political challenges that threaten all governmental systems. The gentle court culture that once seemed eternal has been replaced by military values that celebrate strength and honor above all else. But whether these martial virtues can provide the foundation for stable civilization remains an open question that only time will answer. The death of Minamoto no Yoritomo in 1199 arrives with shocking suddenness, his horse throwing him during what should have been a routine journey, ending the life of Japan's first shogun in a manner that seems almost anticlimactic after the epic struggles that brought him to power. Yet the circumstances surrounding his death matter far less than the institutional crisis it precipitates, as the governmental structures he created face their first great test without the personal authority that made them function effectively. The Kamakura Bakufu suddenly finds itself governed by a child, Minamoto no Yori, whose youth and inexperience make him vulnerable to manipulation by ambitious relatives and advisors who possess their own visions for the future direction of warrior rule. The Hojo clan, through Yoritomo's widow Masako and her father Tokimasa, moves with remarkable speed to fill the power vacuum left by the shogun's death. Their position as the deceased ruler's in-laws provides them with legitimate claims to authority over his minor heir, while their extensive network of political relationships enables them to present themselves as indispensable guardians of institutional stability. The transformation of Masako from grieving widow into the formidable political operator known as the Nun Shogun demonstrates how exceptional circumstances can elevate individuals beyond the normal constraints of social convention, creating new forms of authority that transcend traditional gender limitations. Hojo Tokimasa's assumption of the regency represents more than simple political opportunism. It reflects a sophisticated understanding of how power functions within the complex institutional structures that Yoritomo created. Rather than claiming the shogunal title directly, which might have provoked resistance from other powerful warrior families, Tokimasa positions himself as the protector of legitimate Minamoto authority, while gradually concentrating real decision-making power in his own hands. This indirect approach to political control demonstrates the evolution of warrior statecraft beyond the crude force that characterized earlier periods of military dominance. The elimination of potential rivals proceeds with systematic efficiency as the Hojo consolidate their control over the Kamakura government. Yorie's assassination in 1204, followed by the death of his brother Sanetomo in 1219, effectively ends the Minamoto bloodline while providing the Hojo with opportunities to reshape governmental institutions according to their own preferences. These political murders, while shocking in their brazenness, reflect the harsh realities of medieval succession politics, where sentiment cannot be allowed to interfere with practical considerations of governmental stability. The institutional innovations that emerge during the early Hojo period reveal remarkable political sophistication as the new rulers adapt existing structures to serve their own needs, while maintaining the fiction of legitimate Minamoto authority. The creation of the Council of State in 1225 represents a particularly clever solution to the problem of governing through collective decision-making while preserving individual accountability. This advisory body provides a forum for incorporating the views of important warrior families, while ensuring that final authority remains concentrated in Hojo hands. The legal codification that culminates in the Goseibai Shikimoku of 1232 demonstrates how warrior values can be transformed into systematic jurisprudence capable of governing complex social relationships across diverse territories. These laws, ostensibly designed to clarify existing customs and precedents, actually create new standards of behavior that reflect Hojo preferences while appearing to preserve traditional warrior practices. The code's emphasis on practical justice over ceremonial procedure marks a decisive break with court legal traditions, establishing principles that prioritize effective resolution of disputes over elaborate procedural correctness. Economic policy during the Hojo period reveals increasingly sophisticated approaches to resource management, as the costs of maintaining governmental institutions strain traditional methods of taxation and tribute collection. The development of more systematic approaches to agricultural assessment enables administrators to extract resources more efficiently while avoiding the peasant rebellions that might result from excessive taxation. The integration of commercial activities into governmental revenue streams demonstrates how warrior rulers adapt to changing economic conditions while maintaining their military capabilities. The Mongol threat that emerges during the 1260s provides the Hojo regime with its greatest challenge and most significant opportunity for demonstrating the effectiveness of their governmental innovations. Kublai Khan's demands for Japanese submission force the warrior government to mobilize resources on a scale that tests every aspect of their administrative capabilities while providing opportunities to demonstrate the superiority of military rule over the discredited court system. The systematic preparation for invasion requires coordination between central and provincial authorities that would have been impossible under the fragmented political arrangements of earlier periods. The first Mongol invasion of 1274 reveals both the strengths and limitations of samurai military organization when confronted with foreign enemies employing radically different tactical approaches. The individual combat skills that have made Japanese warriors legendary prove inadequate against disciplined formations of Mongol cavalry supported by Chinese infantry and Korean naval forces. The invasion demonstrates how traditional samurai emphasis on personal honor and single combat becomes counterproductive when facing enemies who prioritize collective action and strategic objectives over individual glory. The technological challenges posed by Mongol weapons and tactics force rapid innovation in Japanese military thinking as samurai commanders struggle to develop effective responses to threats they have never encountered before. The explosive projectiles launched by Mongol catapults create psychological as well as physical damage among warriors accustomed to facing only conventional weapons, while the coordinated cavalry charges that characterize Mongol warfare require new defensive techniques that emphasize group discipline over individual prowess. The adaptation process proves painful, but ultimately successful as Japanese forces learn to coordinate their efforts more effectively. The role of the kamikaze, or divine wind, in destroying the first Mongol fleet becomes a crucial element in Japanese national mythology that will influence military thinking for centuries to come. The interpretation of the typhoon as divine intervention provides religious justification for Japanese resistance to foreign domination, while reinforcing beliefs about the special relationship between the gods and the Japanese people. This theological framework helps maintain morale during the difficult years of preparation for the anticipated second invasion, while providing spiritual foundations for the military mobilization that dominates Japanese society throughout the 1270s. The economic burden of sustained military preparation creates unprecedented challenges for the Hojo administration, as the costs of fortification construction, weapon manufacture, and troop maintenance strain governmental resources beyond their normal capacity. The absence of territorial conquest that might provide new sources of revenue forces administrators to develop innovative approaches to resource mobilization that extract maximum support from existing economic structures without destroying agricultural productivity. The implementation of special taxes and labor obligations demonstrates how military necessity can override traditional limitations on governmental authority. The Second Mongol Invasion of 1281 represents the culmination of both Mongol imperial ambitions and Japanese defensive preparations as massive fleets converge on Kyushu, carrying armies that dwarf any military force previously seen in Japanese waters. The scale of the invasion demonstrates Kublai Khan's determination to incorporate Japan into his expanding empire, while the sophisticated Japanese defensive preparations reveal how effectively the warrior government has mobilized the nation's resources for resistance. The confrontation tests not merely military capabilities, but competing concepts of imperial organization and cultural identity. The prolonged nature of the second invasion, lasting 53 days before the final typhoon destroys the Mongol fleet, provides extensive opportunities for testing the tactical innovations that Japanese commanders have developed during the intervening years. The construction of defensive walls along vulnerable coastlines demonstrates engineering capabilities that rival those of any contemporary civilization, while the coordination of land and naval forces reveals sophisticated understanding of combined operations. The successful defense validates the effectiveness of collective action while maintaining the individual valor that defines samurai identity. The aftermath of the invasions creates new problems that prove as challenging as the military threats themselves, as the financial costs of sustained mobilization strain the governmental system beyond its capacity for normal resource extraction. The traditional rewards for military service become impossible to provide when successful defense generates no territorial gains or plunder for distribution among participating warriors. The resulting dissatisfaction among the samurai class creates political pressures that undermine the stability of the Hojo regime despite their successful leadership during the national crisis. The social transformation that accompanies extended military mobilization becomes apparent as warrior values penetrate more deeply into Japanese society, while traditional court culture continues its gradual decline into irrelevance. The emphasis on military preparedness affects every aspect of social organization, from educational practices that emphasize martial training to religious observances that invoke divine protection against foreign enemies. The militarization of society proceeds so thoroughly that civilian and military functions become virtually indistinguishable in many regions. The international implications of successful resistance to Mongol invasion extend far beyond Japan's immediate security concerns, as news of the defeat spreads throughout East Asia and beyond. The demonstration that Mongol military power can be successfully resisted encourages other potential targets of imperial expansion, while establishing Japan's reputation as a formidable military power capable of defending its independence against the world's most successful conquerors. The psychological impact of these victories influences Japanese national identity in ways that will affect the country's relationship with the outside world for centuries. The cultural production of the invasion period reflects the transformation of Japanese artistic sensibilities as military themes begin dominating literature, painting, and sculpture. The war tales that commemorate the struggles against the Mongols establish new literary traditions that celebrate collective resistance rather than individual achievement, marking a significant departure from earlier narrative forms that emphasized personal glory and romantic adventure. These cultural innovations demonstrate how external threats can stimulate domestic creativity while reinforcing social values that support military effectiveness. Religious developments during this period reveal the complex relationship between spiritual authority and political power, as Buddhist and Shinto institutions adapt their teachings to support the military mobilization required for national defense. The concept of holy war, previously foreign to Japanese religious thinking, emerges as temples and shrines provide theological justification for violence against foreign invaders, while maintaining their traditional emphasis on compassion and spiritual development. The synthesis of martial and spiritual values creates distinctive Japanese approaches to religious practice that influence subsequent cultural development. The diplomatic innovations required for managing relationships with continental powers demonstrate the sophistication of Japanese statecraft as administrators attempt to balance the demands of national security with the benefits of international trade and cultural exchange. The development of intelligence networks that monitor activities in Korea and China reveals systematic approaches to information gathering that complement military preparations while providing early warning of potential threats. These diplomatic capabilities establish precedents for international relations that extend far beyond immediate defense requirements. The technological advances stimulated by military necessity produce innovations that benefit civilian as well as military applications, as craftsmen develop new techniques for metalworking, fortification construction, and naval architecture. The improvement of communication systems required for coordinating defensive efforts creates infrastructure that serves commercial and administrative purposes long after the immediate military threats have passed. The investment in technological development during this period establishes foundations for continued innovation that will influence Japanese civilization for generations. The administrative reforms implemented during the invasion period demonstrate how external challenges can stimulate governmental innovation as the Hojo regime develops new methods for coordinating activities across multiple provinces while maintaining central control over strategic decisions. The creation of specialized military offices and the standardization of defensive procedures establish bureaucratic frameworks that prove valuable for managing other types of crises that require rapid mobilization of resources and personnel. These institutional innovations represent significant advances in governmental effectiveness that extend far beyond their immediate military applications. The psychological impact of successful defense against overwhelming odds creates new forms of national consciousness that unite diverse regional populations around shared experiences of resistance and victory. The development of distinctly Japanese approaches to warfare that emphasize adaptation and perseverance over conventional military virtues establishes cultural patterns that will influence the nation's response to future challenges. The invasion period thus represents not merely a military crisis successfully resolved, but a formative experience that shapes Japanese identity in fundamental ways that continue to influence national development long after the immediate threats have disappeared. As the 13th century draws to a close, the Hojo regime appears to have successfully navigated the greatest external challenge in Japanese history while maintaining governmental stability and social order. Yet the very success of their defensive efforts creates new internal pressures that threaten the foundations of their political authority. The financial strain of prolonged military mobilization, combined with the absence of territorial rewards for loyal service, begins undermining the reciprocal relationships that have sustained warrior society since its emergence during the late Heian period. The stage is set for new forms of political crisis that will test whether the institutional innovations developed during the Kamakura period can adapt to changing circumstances that threaten the fundamental assumptions upon which warrior rule has been constructed. The samurai who have proven so effective at defending Japan against foreign invasion must now confront challenges that emerge from within their own society, where success in external warfare creates internal contradictions that threaten to destroy the very system they have fought to preserve. The mounting financial pressures that follow the Mongol invasions create fissures in the warrior coalition that had sustained Hojo rule for over a century. By the early 14th century, these cracks have widened into chasms that threaten the very foundations of the Kamakura system. The traditional relationship between lord and vassal, built on the exchange of military service for territorial rewards, breaks down when successful defense generates no new lands for distribution, while the costs of maintaining readiness drain existing resources beyond their capacity to sustain the warrior class. Emperor Go-Daigo's rebellion in 1331 provides a focal point for the accumulated grievances that have festered throughout the warrior ranks. The imperial cause, dormant for over a century under the shadow of military rule, suddenly becomes attractive to samurai families whose loyalty to the Hojo has been strained by economic hardship and political marginalization. The emperor's call for restoration of direct imperial rule resonates not because of any genuine enthusiasm for court government, but because it offers an alternative to a system that no longer provides adequate rewards for continued service. The defection of Ashikaga Takauji marks the decisive moment when the Kamakura regime's political foundation collapses beneath the weight of its accumulated contradictions. Takauji, a member of one of the most prestigious warrior families and a longtime supporter of Hojo rule, represents exactly the type of ally that the regime cannot afford to lose. His decision to abandon the Kamakura cause in favor of imperial restoration demonstrates how completely the political calculation has shifted among the warrior elite, as ambitious military leaders recognize that their futures lie with new forms of authority rather than the exhausted institutions of the past. The siege of Kamakura in 1333 unfolds with shocking swiftness as Nitta Yoshisada's forces overwhelm defenses that had seemed impregnable only months before. The systematic destruction of the city and the mass suicide of the Hojo leadership represents more than the end of a particular government. It symbolizes the complete failure of the institutional experiment that had attempted to create stable warrior rule through collective decision-making and bureaucratic administration. The flames that consume the former capital illuminate the fundamental problem that has plagued military government from its inception: how to maintain unity among warriors whose individual ambitions inevitably conflict with collective interests. Emperor Go-Daigo's attempt to restore direct imperial rule through the Kenmu Restoration reveals the profound disconnect between imperial ideals and political realities that has developed during the century and a half of warrior dominance. The emperor's vision of governance, based on classical Chinese models and ancient Japanese precedents, ignores the fundamental changes that have transformed Japanese society since the establishment of the Kamakura Bakufu. His policies alienate the very military leaders whose support made his restoration possible, demonstrating how completely the warrior class has become indispensable to effective governance regardless of theoretical constitutional arrangements. The emperor's attempt to limit warrior autonomy and redistribute their lands according to court precedents strikes at the heart of the military system that has evolved over generations of conflict and accommodation. These policies reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually functions within warrior society, where authority depends not on abstract legal principles, but on practical relationships built through shared risk and mutual benefit. The restoration's failure becomes inevitable when Go-Daigo attempts to govern warriors according to rules designed for court aristocrats, ignoring the military realities that determine political outcomes in 14th century Japan. Ashikaga Takauji's establishment of a rival court at Kyoto in 1336 initiates the southern and northern courts period that will divide Japan for the next 60 years. This schism represents more than a simple dynastic dispute. It reflects deeper tensions about the nature of legitimate authority and the proper relationship between imperial dignity and military power. Different sides against each other, while creating a complex political environment where loyalty, their own territorial and political objectives courts, provides ambitious warrior. The existence of competing imperial families with opportunities to play becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, rather than a sacred obligation transcending personal interest. The military campaigns that characterize the Nanboku-cho period demonstrate how warfare itself has evolved since the decisive battles of the Genpei War. The prolonged nature of the conflict, with its emphasis on territorial control rather than climactic engagements, requires new approaches to military organization that can sustain extended operations across multiple theaters while maintaining political coalitions that transcend immediate military considerations. The development of more sophisticated siege techniques, improved fortification methods, and coordinated campaign strategies reflects the accumulated military knowledge of centuries of warrior culture, adapted to serve the complex demands of civil warfare. The rise of new warrior families during this period reveals how political instability creates opportunities for advancement that would be impossible during times of stable governmental authority. Families like the Hosokawa, Hatakeyama, and Shiba emerge as significant political actors through their ability to provide effective military service while maintaining flexible relationships with competing sources of legitimate authority. Their success demonstrates how warrior culture has evolved beyond simple clan-based loyalty toward more sophisticated forms of political calculation that balance immediate tactical advantages against long-term strategic objectives. The economic disruption caused by prolonged civil conflict accelerates changes in agricultural and commercial practices that had been developing gradually throughout the Kamakura period. The breakdown of centralized authority creates opportunities for local strongmen to establish independent control over productive resources, while forcing agricultural communities to develop new forms of self-defense against the predatory activities of competing military forces. These changes strengthen local autonomy, while weakening the ties that had connected provincial communities to central governmental institutions. The cultural production of this period reflects the uncertainty and violence that characterize daily life as traditional sources of patronage disappear and new forms of artistic expression emerge to serve the needs of a militarized society. The war tales that commemorate contemporary conflicts adopt more realistic approaches to describing violence and its consequences, abandoning the romantic idealization that had characterized earlier military narratives in favor of accounts that acknowledged the brutality and moral ambiguity of extended civil warfare. These literary innovations demonstrate how cultural expression adapts to serve the psychological needs of populations living under conditions of chronic instability. Religious institutions play increasingly complex roles as political actors during this period, with major temples and shrines maintaining their own military forces, while providing sanctuary for refugees and diplomatic venues for negotiating temporary truces between competing factions. The development of warrior monasticism creates new categories of religious practitioners who combine spiritual discipline with military training, producing individuals whose authority transcends conventional boundaries between sacred and secular power. These religious warriors represent another adaptation of traditional institutions to serve the practical needs of a society where violence has become endemic. The technological innovations stimulated by extended conflict produce advances in weapons manufacture, fortification design, and military engineering that establish Japan as one of the most militarily sophisticated societies in the contemporary world. The development of improved metallurgical techniques enables the production of superior weapons and armor, while advances in architectural engineering create defensive structures capable of withstanding prolonged siege operations. These technological developments demonstrate how military necessity drives innovation in ways that benefit civilian as well as military applications. The diplomatic complexity of managing relationships between competing courts, rival military coalitions, and foreign powers requires new forms of statecraft that emphasize flexibility and adaptability over the rigid protocols that had characterized earlier periods of stable governmental authority. The development of professional diplomatic services and the standardization of negotiating procedures establish institutional frameworks that prove valuable long after the immediate political crises that created them have been resolved. These innovations in international relations demonstrate how political instability can ways. The Gua stimulate governmental sophistication, an unexpected dual emergence of Ashikaga supremacy during the 1350s and 1360s reflects not decisive military victory, but patient political work that gradually builds coalitions capable of providing stable governance while accommodating the diverse interests of competing warrior families. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu's eventual success in reunifying the competing triumph of political skill over military force, courts in 1392, represents a demonstrating how effective leadership requires the ability to balance competing demands while maintaining sufficient authority to enforce collective decisions when necessary. The establishment of the Muromachi Bakufu creates governmental structures that attempt to learn from the failures of both the Kamakura system and the Kenmu restoration, by developing more flexible approaches to balancing central authority with provincial autonomy. The new system recognizes that effective governance requires accommodation of regional differences and local power structures, rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative standards across diverse territories. This recognition represents a significant advance in Japanese political thinking that influences governmental development throughout the medieval period. The cultural renaissance that accompanies political stabilization demonstrates how periods of conflict can stimulate creativity by breaking down established patterns of patronage and creating opportunities for new forms of artistic expression. The development of no theatre, the refinement of tea ceremony practices, and the innovation of garden design techniques all reflect the synthesis of warrior values with aristocratic aesthetics that characterizes Ashikaga court culture. These cultural achievements demonstrate how political synthesis can produce artistic innovations that transcend the limitations of their individual contributing traditions. The international relations that developed during the late 14th century reveal how Japan's internal political evolution affects its relationships with neighboring countries, as the restoration of governmental stability enables renewed participation in continental trade networks while maintaining the military capabilities necessary for defending national independence. The tribute missions to Ming China and the expansion of commercial relationships with Korea demonstrate how political unification creates opportunities for international engagement that benefit both governmental revenues and cultural development. The social changes that accompany political transformation become apparent as new forms of warrior identity emerge that emphasize cultural accomplishment alongside military prowess. The ideal of the warrior scholar, exemplified by figures like Imagawa Ryoshun, represents an evolution of samurai culture that adapts to serve the complex demands of governmental administration while maintaining the martial values that define warrior identity. This cultural synthesis establishes patterns that will influence Japanese civilization throughout the early modern period. The religious developments of this era reveal how spiritual institutions adapt to serve the needs of a society undergoing fundamental transformation as Buddhist and Shinto practices evolve to address the psychological and social challenges created by extended periods of political instability. The emergence of new religious movements that emphasize individual spiritual development while maintaining social engagement demonstrates how traditional spiritual frameworks can be modified to serve contemporary needs without abandoning their essential characteristics. As the 14th century draws to a close, the Ashikaga system appears to have successfully resolved the crisis that destroyed the Kamakura Bakufu, while creating institutional structures capable of accommodating the complex political realities of medieval Japan. Yet the very flexibility that enables this success also creates new forms of instability, as the distribution of authority among multiple centers of power makes coordinated action increasingly difficult to achieve. The stage is set for new challenges that will test whether decentralized governance can maintain effective authority over a warrior class, whose local autonomy may ultimately prove incompatible with national unity. The gentle morning mist that rises from the valleys around Kyoto carries with it the promise of cultural flowering, unlike anything Japan has witnessed since the golden age of court civilization. Yet beneath this aesthetic renaissance lies a political structure so complex and fragmented that effective governance becomes increasingly dependent on personal relationships rather than institutional authority. The Ashikaga shoguns, ruling from their Muromachi district headquarters, must navigate between the competing demands of powerful provincial families whose local autonomy has grown to rival central authority itself. The Shugo daimyo system that emerges during the 15th century represents both the greatest achievement and the fundamental weakness of Ashikaga governance. These regional lords, appointed as military governors but gradually evolving into autonomous territorial rulers, possess sufficient local authority to maintain order within their domains while lacking the incentives necessary for effective coordination with central policy. The result is a political structure that provides stability through decentralization, while sacrificing the capacity for decisive action that characterized earlier periods of military rule. The Onin War that erupts in 1467 reveals how completely the balance of power has shifted from central to regional authority, as what begins as a succession dispute within the shogunal family escalates into a nationwide conflict that devastates the capital while demonstrating the impotence of central governmental institutions. The systematic destruction of Kyoto during 11 years of urban warfare symbolizes the collapse of the political synthesis that had enabled the Ashikaga to maintain nominal authority over increasingly autonomous provincial strongmen. The emergence of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring provinces, marks the complete fragmentation of central authority as regional daimyo pursue their own territorial ambitions, without reference to shogunal approval or imperial legitimacy. This period of endemic warfare lasting over a century demonstrates how military culture, when freed from institutional constraints, tends toward endless competition that consumes the very resources it seeks to protect. The survival strategies developed during this era of constant conflict will fundamentally reshape samurai culture in ways that emphasize practical effectiveness over ceremonial tradition. The technological revolution that accompanies the arrival of Portuguese firearms in 1543 transforms the nature of Japanese warfare more dramatically than any innovation since the introduction of mounted archery a millennium earlier. The adaptation of European military technology to Japanese tactical requirements demonstrates the remarkable capacity for innovation that characterizes warrior culture when faced with challenges that threaten existing military advantages. The rapid development of domestic firearms manufacturing reveals how military necessity can drive technological advancement beyond the capabilities of the original foreign models. Yet even as Japan fragments politically and transforms militarily, the cultural achievements of this period establish artistic and intellectual traditions that will influence Japanese civilization for centuries to come. The refinement of aesthetic principles through tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and garden design creates forms of cultural expression that synthesize warrior values with aristocratic sensibilities in ways that transcend their individual origins. These cultural innovations demonstrate how periods of political instability can stimulate creativity by breaking down established patterns of patronage while creating opportunities for new forms of artistic expression. The religious transformations of the Sengoku period reveal how spiritual institutions adapt to serve the needs of a society where traditional sources of authority have collapsed, and new forms of legitimacy must be constructed from available cultural materials. The rise of Nichiren Buddhism and the political activism of Iko-Iki leagues demonstrate how religious communities can become significant military and political actors when secular institutions prove inadequate to the challenges of maintaining social order. The international dimensions of Japan's political fragmentation create both opportunities and vulnerabilities, as European traders and missionaries arrive in a country whose decentralized authority makes systematic policy coordination impossible. The Jesuit mission's remarkable success in gaining converts among the warrior class reflects not merely the appeal of Christian theology, but the absence of unified governmental policies capable of regulating foreign religious activities. The gradual recognition that political fragmentation makes Japan vulnerable to the type of colonial exploitation that has affected other Asian societies will eventually provide powerful incentives for political reunification. The three great unifiers who emerged during the late 16th century, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, represent the culmination of centuries of warrior political development as they combine traditional military virtues with innovative approaches to governance that enable them to overcome the centrifugal forces that have fragmented Japan for over a century. Their success demonstrates how exceptional leadership can harness the destructive energies of warrior competition and redirect them toward constructive purposes that serve broader social needs while satisfying individual ambitions for advancement and recognition. The systematic campaigns that gradually reunify Japan under central authority reveal how military technology, political innovation, and cultural synthesis can combine to create governmental capabilities that exceed anything previously achieved in Japanese history. The development of coordinated strategies that integrate siege warfare, naval operations, and diplomatic negotiation demonstrates the sophistication that warrior statecraft has achieved through centuries of continuous adaptation to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. The social engineering projects that accompany political reunification, including the separation of warrior and farmer classes, the establishment of systematic taxation methods, and the creation of standardized legal procedures, represent conscious attempts to construct social order that can maintain stability while accommodating the diverse interests of a complex society. These reforms demonstrate how successful political leadership requires not merely military victory, but the institutional creativity necessary for transforming conquest into lasting governmental authority. The international isolation that follows reunification reflects sophisticated understanding of how domestic political stability can be threatened by external influences that provide alternative sources of legitimacy and authority. The decision to restrict foreign contact while maintaining carefully controlled trade relationships demonstrates how national policy can balance the benefits of international engagement against the risks of foreign interference in domestic political arrangements. The cultural flowering that accompanies political stability demonstrates how effective governance creates conditions that enable artistic and intellectual achievement by providing patronage systems and social frameworks that support creative activity. The development of distinctive Japanese approaches to literature, theatre, and visual arts during the early Tokugawa period establishes cultural traditions that express uniquely Japanese values while incorporating influences from both domestic and foreign sources. As Japan enters the early modern period under Tokugawa rule, the samurai have completed their transformation from provincial warriors into a hereditary ruling class whose authority rests as much on administrative competence as military prowess. The institutional structures they have created will provide stability and prosperity for over 2.5 centuries, demonstrating the ultimate success of the warrior experiment in governance that began with the collapse of court rule during the late Heian period. Yet, this success carries within it the seeds of its own eventual obsolescence, as the very stability that justifies warrior rule gradually eliminates the military threats that originally made their services indispensable. The peaceful society that effective governance creates will eventually question whether hereditary military privilege remains necessary in a world where actual warfare has become obsolete. The final chapter of samurai history thus begins with their greatest triumph: the creation of a political system so successful that it will ultimately make their continued existence as a distinct warrior class historically unnecessary. The Tokugawa consolidation of power during the early 17th century represents the most comprehensive attempt at social engineering in Japanese history, as the new shogunal government systematically reconstructs every aspect of society according to principles designed to prevent the return of the chaos that had consumed the archipelago for over a century. The establishment of the Sankin Kotai system, requiring daimyo to maintain residences in Edo while leaving their families as permanent hostages to shogunal authority, demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that characterizes successful authoritarian rule. This arrangement transforms potential rebellion into expensive theatre, as provincial lords compete to display their loyalty through increasingly elaborate processions and costly urban establishments. The rigid class system codified during this period creates social boundaries so absolute that movement between categories becomes virtually impossible, transforming the fluid hierarchies of medieval warrior society into a frozen tableau where birth determines destiny with mathematical precision. The samurai find themselves elevated to the apex of this structure, yet paradoxically constrained by the very success of the peace they have created. No longer needed as warriors in a society where warfare has been eliminated, they must justify their privileged position through administrative service and cultural refinement that often sits uneasily with their martial heritage. The transformation of castle towns into centers of commercial and cultural activity reveals how military architecture adapts to serve peaceful authority necessary for effective purposes while maintaining the symbolic governance. These urban centers, originally designed as defensive positions for controlling strategic territories, evolve into complex economic ecosystems where samurai administrators interact with merchant communities whose growing wealth creates new forms of social tension. The gradual emergence of a money economy challenges traditional concepts of value based on rice production and military service, forcing warrior families to adapt to financial realities that their ancestors would have found incomprehensible. Educational innovations during this period reflect the systematic attempt to transform a warrior class bred for combat into administrative officials capable of governing a complex society during an extended period of peace. The development of domain schools and private academies creates institutions dedicated to producing scholar administrators whose training emphasizes Confucian ethics alongside traditional martial arts. This curriculum attempts to preserve warrior identity while adapting it to serve the practical needs of bureaucratic governance, creating internal tensions that will influence samurai psychology throughout the Tokugawa period. The cultural flowering that accompanies political stability produces artistic achievements that synthesize centuries of aesthetic development into distinctly Japanese forms of expression that transcend their individual historical origins. The kabuki theater, with its celebration of merchant values and urban sophistication, provides alternative cultural models that challenge traditional warrior aesthetics while creating new forms of popular entertainment. The emergence of ukiyo-e woodblock printing democratizes artistic consumption, making sophisticated visual culture available to social classes that had previously been excluded from aesthetic participation. Neo-Confucian philosophy becomes the official ideology of Tokugawa governance, providing intellectual frameworks that justify social hierarchy while emphasizing moral cultivation and administrative competence over military prowess. The adaptation of Chinese philosophical concepts to serve Japanese governmental needs demonstrates remarkable intellectual flexibility as scholars develop synthetic approaches that preserve essential elements of warrior culture while subordinating them to broader social purposes. The emphasis on loyalty, duty, and self-cultivation provides ethical foundations for peaceful governance while maintaining continuity with traditional samurai values. The economic policies implemented during the early Tokugawa period reveal sophisticated understanding of how commercial activity can be regulated to serve political stability. without destroying the productivity necessary for supporting governmental institutions. The establishment of merchant guilds and the regulation of commodity prices create controlled markets that generate revenue for domain governments while preventing the type of economic disruption that might threaten social order. These policies demonstrate how successful governance requires balancing competing economic interests rather than simply imposing military authority over commercial activities. The religious settlement achieved through the temple registration system transforms Buddhist institutions into instruments of social control, while preserving their spiritual functions and cultural authority. Every family's mandatory affiliation with a specific temple creates comprehensive surveillance networks that monitor population movements while providing social services that complement governmental administration. This arrangement demonstrates how traditional religious institutions can be adapted to serve state purposes without completely destroying their autonomous cultural significance. The gradual emergence of distinct regional cultures within the unified Tokugawa system reveals how political centralization can accommodate local diversity when governmental structures provide sufficient flexibility for adaptation to varying geographical and economic conditions. The development of distinctive artistic traditions, dialect variations, and commercial specializations within different domains creates cultural richness that enhances rather than threatens national unity. These regional variations demonstrate how successful governance can preserve local identity while maintaining overall political coherence. The international isolation policies that culminate in the complete exclusion of foreign influence, except through carefully controlled Dutch and Chinese trading relationships, reflect sophisticated analysis of how external contacts can threaten domestic political stability. The decision to sacrifice potential economic benefits from expanded international trade in order to maintain governmental control over social and cultural development represents one of the most systematic attempts at national isolation in world history. This policy demonstrates how political leaders can consciously choose cultural preservation over economic expansion when they perceive fundamental threats to their authority. The social tensions that begin emerging during the Middle Tokugawa period reveal how even the most carefully constructed political systems generate internal contradictions that eventually challenge their founding assumptions. The growing wealth of merchant classes creates alternative sources of social prestige that compete with traditional warrior status, while the increasing sophistication of urban culture provides lifestyle models that challenge rural agricultural values. These developments demonstrate how social change continues, even within systems designed to prevent transformation. The intellectual ferment that characterizes late Tokugawa scholarship reflects growing awareness that Japan's isolation cannot be maintained indefinitely in a world where technological and political changes threaten to make traditional governmental methods obsolete. The emergence of Rangaku, or Dutch learning, creates scientific knowledge that challenges traditional explanations of natural phenomena, while providing practical capabilities that enhance national defense. The growing interest in kokugaku, or national learning, reveals attempts to discover distinctly Japanese cultural foundations that can serve as alternatives to Chinese intellectual traditions. The peasant uprisings that become increasingly frequent during the 18th and 19th centuries demonstrate how extended peace creates social expectations that governmental institutions struggle to satisfy when economic pressures threaten traditional relationships between rulers and subjects. These rebellions, while typically limited in scope and conservative in their demands, reveal underlying tensions about the distribution of resources and the legitimacy of hereditary privilege that had been suppressed during periods of military crisis. The governmental responses to these challenges test the flexibility of Tokugawa institutions while revealing their underlying limitations. The artistic innovations of the late Tokugawa period reflect growing sophistication in popular culture that challenges traditional elite monopolies over aesthetic expression. The development of sophisticated popular literature, innovative theatrical forms, and refined craft traditions demonstrates how extended peace enables cultural creativity that transcends class boundaries while creating new forms of social identity. These cultural developments provide alternative sources of meaning and status that compete with traditional warrior values while enriching the overall texture of Japanese civilization. The technological stagnation that characterizes much of the Tokugawa period reflects conscious policy decisions to limit innovation that might disrupt social stability. Yet this very stability creates conditions that enable refinement of existing techniques to extraordinary levels of sophistication. The development of precision craftsmanship in metallurgy, textiles, and woodworking demonstrates how cultural isolation can stimulate intensive development within established parameters, while limiting exposure to revolutionary innovations that might challenge existing social arrangements. The demographic changes that occur during the Tokugawa period reveal how political stability affects population dynamics in ways that create new social pressures requiring governmental adaptation. The growth of urban populations and the development of commercial agriculture create labor markets that operate according to principles different from traditional agricultural relationships based on hereditary obligation. These changes force modification of traditional social categories while maintaining the appearance of continuity with established practices. The financial problems that increasingly plague both the shogunal government and individual domains during the later Tokugawa period demonstrate how even successful political systems can be undermined by long-term economic trends that exceed their capacity for adaptation. The growing costs of maintaining elaborate governmental structures during peacetime, combined with the increasing sophistication of commercial networks that escape traditional taxation methods, create fiscal crises that threaten the economic foundations of warrior rule. These problems reveal fundamental contradictions between the requirements for maintaining political authority and the economic realities of governing a complex society. The foreign policy challenges that emerged during the 19th century as Western powers seek to force Japan into the international trading system test every aspect of Tokugawa governmental capabilities, while revealing how domestic political arrangements can become liabilities when dealing with external threats that operate according to different rules. The arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet in 1853 represents more than a simple diplomatic crisis. It symbolizes the collision between two incompatible approaches to organizing political authority and international relations. The internal debates that consume Japanese leadership during the Bakumatsu period reveal how extended isolation has created intellectual frameworks that prove inadequate for analyzing challenges that transcend traditional categories of political thought. The struggle to develop effective responses to foreign pressure while maintaining domestic stability demonstrates how even sophisticated governmental systems can be paralyzed by problems that exceed their conceptual and institutional capabilities. The growing recognition that fundamental change has become inevitable creates psychological crises that affect every level of society. The emergence of new political movements that challenge traditional governmental authority reflects the breakdown of consensus about the legitimacy of existing institutions when they prove incapable of protecting national independence. The Sono-Joi movement, with its call for imperial restoration and foreign expulsion, provides alternative political visions that appeal to groups whose interests have been marginalized by Tokugawa policies. These movements demonstrate how political crises can activate dormant sources of authority that had seemed permanently subordinated to established governmental structures. The young samurai who emerge as leaders of political transformation during the 1860s represent the culmination of centuries of warrior political development as they combine traditional martial values with innovative approaches to governance that enable them to navigate unprecedented challenges. Their success in overthrowing the Tokugawa system while maintaining social order demonstrates how warrior culture has evolved to produce leadership capabilities that transcend the specific historical circumstances that originally created the samurai class. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marks the beginning of the final phase of samurai history, as the new imperial government systematically dismantles the institutional structures that had sustained warrior privilege, while attempting to preserve the cultural values that had made samurai leadership effective. This process of selective preservation and deliberate destruction represents one of the most sophisticated attempts at managed social transformation in modern history, demonstrating how political leaders can consciously direct cultural change while maintaining essential continuity with historical traditions. The abolition of the Han system and the establishment of prefectural government eliminates the territorial basis of daimyo authority while creating new administrative structures that can serve the needs of a modernizing state. The transformation of former samurai into government officials, military officers, and business leaders demonstrates how traditional elite groups can adapt to serve new social functions when political change provides appropriate incentives and institutional frameworks. This process reveals both the flexibility and the limitations of warrior culture when confronted with the demands of industrial modernization. The establishment of universal military conscription and the creation of a modern national army represent the final transformation of Japanese military organization from an elite warrior monopoly into a mass institution that serves the needs of a modern nation-state. The resistance to these changes among some samurai groups reflects deeper concerns about the preservation of cultural identity and social status that had been intimately connected to exclusive military privileges. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 provides the dramatic conclusion to this process, as traditional samurai warfare confronts modern military technology in engagements that demonstrate the obsolescence of individual martial prowess in an age of industrial warfare. Yet even as the institutional structures that had sustained samurai society disappear, the cultural values and psychological attitudes that had defined warrior identity continue to influence Japanese civilization in ways that transcend their original historical context. The emphasis on loyalty, duty, and self-sacrifice becomes integrated into modern Japanese nationalism, while the aesthetic sensibilities developed during centuries of warrior culture continue to shape artistic expression and cultural identity. The transformation of samurai values into components of modern Japanese civilization demonstrates how cultural traditions can survive the destruction of the social institutions that originally created them. The gentle evening light that filters through the bamboo groves surrounding modern Japanese temples carries whispers of a warrior heritage that has become permanently woven into the fabric of national consciousness, influencing everything from business practices to artistic expression in ways that connect contemporary Japan to its samurai past through invisible threads of cultural continuity that prove stronger than the political institutions that once seemed eternal. The industrial machinery of the Meiji era thunders across the archipelago like a great metal dragon consuming the ancient ways. Yet within its mechanical roar lies something deeper than mere technological transformation. The samurai who survive this great upheaval discover that their centuries of disciplined training, their cultivation of mental fortitude, and their systematic approach to mastering complex skills prove remarkably adaptable to the demands of modern enterprise. The same psychological frameworks that enabled warriors to face death without flinching now enable them to navigate the uncertainties of industrial capitalism, while the hierarchical thinking that governed domain administration translates seamlessly into corporate management structures. The Zaibatsu industrial combines that emerged during the late 19th century bear unmistakable resemblances to the military organizations that dominated medieval Japan, with their emphasis on personal loyalty, collective decision-making, and long-term strategic planning that subordinates immediate profit to broader institutional objectives. Former samurai families like the Mitsubishi founders bring warrior approaches to business development that emphasize reputation over short-term gain, creating commercial empires built on principles of honor and mutual obligation that would have been familiar to their ancestors who served territorial lords centuries earlier. The educational revolution that accompanies modernization reveals how thoroughly warrior values penetrate the new institutional structures being created throughout Japanese society. The emphasis on moral cultivation, physical discipline, and unwavering dedication to collective goals transforms schools into training grounds that produce citizens whose psychological preparation mirrors the mental conditioning that had characterized samurai development. The famous imperial rescript on education codifies these principles into systematic pedagogy that shapes Japanese national character in ways that preserve essential elements of warrior culture within modern educational frameworks. The military modernization that creates the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy demonstrates how traditional concepts of service and sacrifice adapt to serve contemporary strategic requirements while maintaining psychological continuity with historical warrior traditions. The officer corps that emerges from this transformation combines technical expertise with spiritual discipline that reflects centuries of samurai emphasis on cultivating both martial skills and moral character. The Bushido revival that characterizes late Meiji military thinking represents not mere nostalgia, but conscious adaptation of proven psychological methods to serve modern military requirements. The constitutional settlement that establishes the framework for modern Japanese governance reveals sophisticated understanding of how traditional authority relationships can be preserved within contemporary political institutions. The Meiji Constitution's emphasis on imperial authority, channeled through appointed ministers, creates governmental structures that maintain hierarchical principles while adapting them to serve the administrative needs of an industrial society. The Genro system that provides informal coordination between government, military, and business leadership reflects traditional Japanese approaches to collective decision-making that transcend formal institutional boundaries. The cultural productions of this era demonstrate remarkable creativity in synthesizing traditional aesthetic values with contemporary artistic techniques imported from European sources. The development of modern Japanese literature, painting, and architecture reveals how cultural innovation can proceed through conscious integration of domestic and foreign influences rather than simple imitation of external models. Writers like Natsume Soseki explore the psychological tensions created by rapid social change while maintaining narrative approaches that reflect traditional Japanese sensibilities about character development and moral instruction. The social engineering projects that attempt to create modern citizens from traditional subjects reveal both the possibilities and limitations of directed cultural transformation. The family system reforms that modify traditional household structures while preserving essential hierarchical relationships demonstrate how social change can be managed to serve political objectives without completely destroying cultural continuity. The women's education initiatives that prepare females for new social roles while maintaining traditional concepts of domestic responsibility reflect similar approaches to balancing innovation with preservation. The international relations that develop during this period reveal how Japan's unique historical experience enables distinctive approaches to engaging with the global community while maintaining cultural autonomy. The successful renegotiation of the unequal treaties imposed during the Bakumatsu period demonstrates sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that combine traditional negotiating methods with contemporary international law. The emergence of Japan as a regional power through victories over China and Russia reveals how modernized military capabilities can serve traditional strategic objectives related to national security and regional influence. The colonial expansion that characterizes early 20th century Japanese policy reflects the application of traditional territorial concepts to contemporary geopolitical opportunities. The annexation of Korea and the establishment of influence over Manchuria demonstrate how historical patterns of expansion and control adapt to serve modern strategic requirements, while maintaining cultural frameworks that emphasize civilizing missions and hierarchical relationships between advanced and developing societies. These policies reveal both the strengths and dangers of applying traditional thinking to contemporary challenges that operate according to different rules and assumptions. The economic development that transforms Japan from an agricultural society into an industrial power reveals how traditional social organization can facilitate rapid modernization when political leadership provides appropriate direction and institutional frameworks. The cooperation between government and private enterprise that characterizes Meiji economic policy reflects historical precedents for coordination between political and commercial interests that transcend simple market relationships. The emphasis on technological innovation combined with cultural preservation demonstrates how modernization can proceed without destroying essential elements of national identity. The urban transformation that creates modern Japanese cities reveals how traditional architectural and social concepts adapt to serve contemporary requirements while maintaining aesthetic and cultural continuity with historical precedents. The development of Tokyo as a modern capital demonstrates sophisticated urban planning that integrates functional requirements with cultural values that reflect centuries of Japanese thinking about spatial organization and social hierarchy. The emergence of new forms of popular culture within these urban environments creates opportunities for artistic expression that transcends traditional class boundaries while maintaining essential elements of Japanese aesthetic sensibility. The religious adaptations that enable traditional spiritual institutions to serve modern social functions demonstrate remarkable institutional flexibility in responding to changing circumstances without abandoning core theological principles. The state Shinto system that provides spiritual foundations for modern nationalism synthesizes traditional religious concepts with contemporary political requirements in ways that strengthen rather than weaken spiritual authority. The Buddhist reforms that adapt ancient teaching methods to serve modern educational and social service functions reveal similar capacity for institutional innovation within traditional frameworks. The technological mastery that enables Japan to compete successfully with Western industrial powers demonstrates how traditional approaches to learning and skill development can accelerate the absorption of foreign knowledge when cultural frameworks emphasize systematic study and practical application. The rapid development of indigenous technological capabilities in areas ranging from steel production to naval construction reveals how warrior emphasis on mastering complex skills translates effectively into industrial contexts that require similar combinations of technical knowledge and disciplined practice. The artistic innovations that create distinctly modern Japanese cultural forms reveal how traditional aesthetic principles can generate new forms of expression when exposed to contemporary influences and opportunities. The development of modern Japanese music, theater, and visual arts demonstrates creative synthesis that preserves essential elements of historical culture while incorporating techniques and perspectives that expand expressive possibilities. These cultural achievements establish Japan's position as a significant contributor to global artistic development while maintaining distinctive national characteristics. The social problems that emerge during rapid industrialization create challenges that test the adaptability of traditional institutional responses, while revealing the limitations of historical approaches to managing social change. The labor conflicts that characterize early industrial development demonstrate how traditional concepts of mutual obligation require modification to address the realities of modern employment relationships. The urban poverty that accompanies industrial growth creates social welfare challenges that exceed the capacity of traditional charitable institutions, while demanding new approaches to maintaining social stability. The intellectual ferment that accompanies modernization produces philosophical and literary works that explore the psychological implications of cultural transformation, while maintaining continuity with traditional approaches to moral and aesthetic questions. The emergence of modern Japanese philosophy through thinkers who synthesize Western analytical methods with Eastern spiritual traditions demonstrates how intellectual innovation can proceed through creative integration rather than simple adoption of foreign concepts. These scholarly achievements establish Japanese intellectual culture as a distinctive contributor to global philosophical development. The political movements that emerge during the Taisho period reveal how democratic concepts adapt to serve Japanese social and cultural requirements while challenging traditional authority structures in ways that test the flexibility of established institutions. The development of political parties, labor organizations, and social reform movements demonstrates how modern political participation can develop within cultural frameworks that emphasize collective harmony and hierarchical respect. These political innovations create new forms of civic engagement while maintaining essential elements of traditional social organization. The international recognition that Japan achieves during this period, through participation in global institutions and successful military campaigns, demonstrates how modernization can enhance, rather than diminish, national prestige when cultural adaptation preserves essential elements of historical identity. Japan's emergence as a great power reflects not mere imitation of Western models, but creative synthesis of traditional capabilities with contemporary requirements. The respect that Japanese achievements earn from international observers validates approaches to modernization that maintain cultural autonomy while embracing technological and institutional innovation. The cultural confidence that characterizes Japan during the early 20th century reflects successful resolution of the tensions between tradition and modernity that had created psychological crises during the initial phases of modernization. The emergence of distinctly Japanese approaches to modern life demonstrates how cultural synthesis can create new forms of civilization that transcend the limitations of both historical traditions and foreign models. This cultural maturity establishes foundations for continued development that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential elements of national character. The military expansion that culminates in the Pacific War represents both the ultimate expression of traditional warrior values, adapted to serve modern strategic objectives, and the tragic demonstration of how historical concepts can become dangerously obsolete when applied to contemporary challenges that exceed their conceptual frameworks. The Bushido revival that provides spiritual foundations for wartime mobilization reveals how traditional values can be manipulated to serve political purposes that distort their original meaning, while maintaining their psychological power. The systematic preparation for total war demonstrates organizational capabilities that reflect centuries of military development, while revealing the dangers of applying historical thinking to contemporary challenges that operate according to different rules. The social mobilization that transforms Japanese society into a unified instrument of national policy demonstrates both the effectiveness of traditional approaches to collective action and their potential for creating destructive forms of mass behavior when directed toward inappropriate objectives. The neighborhood associations, youth organizations, and women's groups that coordinate wartime activities reveal how traditional social structures can be adapted to serve modern administrative requirements while maintaining cultural forms that preserve community identity. Yet these same organizational capabilities that enable impressive collective achievements also facilitate the suppression of individual conscience and critical thinking that might challenge official policies. The technological achievements that enable Japan to compete militarily with the world's most advanced industrial powers demonstrate how traditional approaches to technical mastery can accelerate innovation when cultural frameworks emphasize systematic study and practical application. The development of advanced aircraft, naval vessels, and weapons systems reveals engineering capabilities that reflect centuries of craftsmanship traditions adapted to serve contemporary military requirements. Yet these same technological capabilities that enable impressive military achievements also create destructive potential that exceeds the moral frameworks available for controlling their application. The imperial expansion that extends Japanese control across much of East and Southeast Asia represents the culmination of traditional concepts of hierarchical order applied to contemporary geopolitical opportunities. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere provides ideological justification for regional dominance that draws on historical precedents for civilizing missions while adapting them to serve modern strategic objectives. Yet the practical implementation of these policies reveals fundamental contradictions between traditional concepts of benevolent governance and the harsh realities of military occupation that serve primarily Japanese rather than regional interests. The defeat that ends Japanese imperial ambitions in 1945 represents not merely military failure, but the complete collapse of the synthetic worldview that had enabled traditional values to serve modern purposes. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki symbolizes the obsolescence of individual courage and spiritual discipline when confronted with technological capabilities that transcend human scale and comprehension. The surrender that follows this catastrophe forces fundamental reconsideration of the relationship between traditional culture and contemporary reality in ways that will reshape Japanese civilization more thoroughly than any previous historical transformation. Yet even in defeat, the disciplined response of Japanese society to occupation and reconstruction demonstrates how deeply traditional values have penetrated national character in ways that transcend specific political institutions or military organizations. The peaceful cooperation with Allied authorities, the systematic approach to rebuilding destroyed cities, and the collective commitment to creating new forms of democratic government reveal cultural capabilities that reflect centuries of warrior training in adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining essential elements of identity and purpose. The constitutional settlement that establishes the framework for post-war Japanese democracy demonstrates how traditional concepts of social harmony and collective responsibility can adapt to serve contemporary political requirements while preserving essential elements of national character. The pacifist constitution that renounces war as an instrument of national policy represents conscious rejection of the military traditions that had dominated Japanese development for over a millennium. Yet the social discipline and institutional effectiveness that characterize post-war governance reveal continued influence of historical approaches to collective organization and decision-making. The economic miracle that transforms Japan into one of the world's most prosperous societies demonstrates how traditional values related to hard work, collective effort, and long-term thinking can serve contemporary requirements while adapting to changed circumstances. The corporate culture that emerges during this period reflects historical precedents for hierarchical organization and mutual obligation, while incorporating contemporary management techniques and technological innovation. The quality control methods, lifetime employment systems, and consensus decision-making processes that characterize Japanese business reveal continued influence of warrior culture, adapted to serve peaceful purposes. The cultural renaissance that accompanies economic prosperity produces artistic and intellectual achievements that synthesize traditional Japanese sensibilities with contemporary global influences in ways that establish Japan as a significant contributor to world culture. The literature, cinema, and visual arts that emerge during this period demonstrate creative capabilities that reflect centuries of aesthetic development while engaging with universal themes that transcend cultural boundaries. These achievements establish Japan's position as a distinctive voice within global cultural dialogue, while maintaining essential elements of national identity. The technological leadership that Japan achieves in areas ranging from electronics to automotive manufacture demonstrates how traditional approaches to craftsmanship and technical mastery adapt to serve contemporary industrial requirements while maintaining cultural values that emphasize quality and continuous improvement. The innovation that characterizes Japanese technology reflects historical precedents for systematic study and practical application, combined with contemporary research methods and international collaboration. These achievements establish Japan as a global leader in technological development while preserving cultural approaches that distinguish Japanese products and methods from those of competitors. The social stability that characterizes post-war Japanese society demonstrates how traditional values can provide foundations for democratic governance when political institutions provide appropriate channels for participation and representation. The low crime rates, educational achievement, and social cohesion that distinguish Japanese society reflect continued influence of historical approaches to community organization and individual responsibility adapted to serve contemporary requirements. These social achievements demonstrate how cultural continuity can enhance rather than hinder adaptation to changing circumstances, when traditional values support rather than oppose beneficial innovation. The international role that Japan develops during the late 20th century reveals how historical experience can provide distinctive perspectives on global challenges while contributing to international cooperation and development. The economic assistance programs, technological transfers, and diplomatic initiatives that characterize Japanese foreign policy reflect traditional concepts of regional responsibility and civilizing missions adapted to serve contemporary, humanitarian, and strategic objectives. These international contributions establish Japan as a responsible global citizen while maintaining cultural autonomy and national interests. The environmental consciousness that emerges during this period demonstrates how traditional concepts of harmony between human activity and natural processes can provide frameworks for addressing contemporary ecological challenges. The development of efficient technologies, conservation practices, and sustainable development approaches reflects historical precedents for balancing human needs with natural limitations, while incorporating contemporary scientific understanding and international cooperation. These environmental initiatives establish Japan as a leader in addressing global ecological challenges while preserving cultural values that emphasize long-term thinking and collective responsibility. As the 21st century unfolds with its unprecedented global challenges and opportunities, the legacy of samurai culture continues to influence Japanese responses to changing circumstances in ways that demonstrate both the enduring power of historical traditions and their capacity for adaptation to serve contemporary needs. The values of discipline, loyalty, and collective effort that defined warrior culture for over a millennium provide psychological and institutional foundations that enable Japanese society to address current challenges while maintaining cultural identity and social cohesion. The digital revolution that transforms global communication and commerce creates opportunities for Japanese innovation that build on historical traditions of technical mastery and aesthetic refinement while engaging with international networks that transcend cultural boundaries. The video games, animation, and digital technologies that establish Japan as a global cultural leader reflect synthesis of traditional artistic sensibilities with contemporary technological capabilities in ways that create new forms of cultural expression that influence global popular culture while maintaining distinctly Japanese characteristics. The demographic challenges that face contemporary Japanese society test the adaptability of traditional institutions and values when confronted with unprecedented social changes that exceed historical precedents for management and adaptation. The aging population, declining birth rates, and changing family structures create social welfare and economic challenges that require innovative approaches to maintaining social stability while preserving cultural values that emphasize intergenerational responsibility and collective support. These challenges reveal both the strengths and limitations of traditional approaches to social organization when applied to contemporary circumstances that operate according to different assumptions and requirements. Yet through all these transformations, the essential spirit that animated the samurai continues to influence Japanese civilization in ways that connect contemporary achievements to historical traditions through invisible threads of cultural continuity that prove more durable than the political institutions and social structures that once seemed permanent. The gentle strength that enabled warriors to face death without flinching now enables their descendants to face an uncertain future with confidence that cultural wisdom accumulated over centuries of adaptation and innovation will provide guidance for navigating whatever challenges await in the years to come. The transformation proves as complete as it is silent, measured not in the clash of swords or the thunder of cavalry charges, but in the gentle rustle of paper as former warriors bend over accounting ledgers, their calloused hands that once gripped katana, now wielding brushes to calculate profit margins and production quotas. The psychological architecture that had enabled samurai to face death without hesitation reveals its remarkable adaptability, as these same mental frameworks prove equally effective for navigating the uncertainties of industrial competition. where business failure carries social consequences that echo the dishonor their ancestors feared more than mortality itself. The Zaibatsu conglomerates that emerged during the Meiji transformation bear the unmistakable imprint of military organization translated into commercial enterprise, with their emphasis on hierarchical loyalty, strategic patience, and collective decision-making that subordinates individual ambition to institutional objectives. Former samurai entrepreneurs like Iwasaki Yataro, founder of Mitsubishi, demonstrate how warrior approaches to leadership naturally evolve into business philosophies that prioritize long-term reputation over immediate profit, creating commercial dynasties built on principles of honor and mutual obligation that would have seemed familiar to territorial lords governing distant provinces centuries earlier. The educational revolution that sweeps across Japan during this period reveals the profound influence of warrior pedagogical methods on the formation of modern Japanese character. As schools become training grounds that systematically cultivate mental discipline, physical endurance, and unwavering dedication to collective achievement. The imperial rescript on education codifies these principles into a comprehensive system of moral instruction that shapes national consciousness, according to frameworks developed through centuries of samurai character cultivation, producing citizens whose psychological preparation mirrors the spiritual conditioning that had characterized warrior development since the Heian period. The military modernization that creates the imperial armed forces demonstrates how traditional concepts of service and sacrifice adapt seamlessly to contemporary strategic requirements, while preserving the essential spiritual foundations that had made samurai armies so effective throughout Japanese history. The officer corps that emerges from military academies combines cutting-edge technical expertise with the moral discipline that reflects centuries of Bushido cultivation, creating professional soldiers whose commitment to duty transcends personal survival while embracing technological innovations that multiply their battlefield effectiveness exponentially. The distant temple bells that echo across modern Japan carry within their bronze voices the eternal spirit of 8 centuries that transformed a gentle court civilization into a warrior nation, then ultimately into something far more profound than either. The samurai began as simple provincial guards, men who served powerful families in an age when central authority crumbled and local strength determined survival. They evolved through generations of conflict and adaptation into the architects of governmental systems that would endure for nearly 700 years, proving that true leadership emerges not from birth or wealth, but from the disciplined cultivation of character, the willingness to sacrifice personal interest for collective good, and the courage to face an uncertain future with unwavering resolve. Their legacy lives on, not in museums or monuments, but in the invisible foundations of modern Japanese civilization, where their values of loyalty, dedication, and honor continue to shape a nation that has learned to channel the warrior spirit toward peaceful purposes, creating prosperity from discipline and harmony from strength.